1960, more than 8 million American women were taking amphetamines prescribed by their own doctors, not to stay awake, not to recover from illness, but simply to stay thin. You are standing at a mirror. It is early morning, the particular early morning that belongs only to you, before the house has found its noise, before the day has asked anything of you. The light is thin and honest. It does not flatter, it does not punish. It simply arrives, the way light has always arrived, indifferent to what it illuminates. You have stood at this mirror before, not this one maybe, not this specific glass in this specific frame, but this moment, this pause, this quiet negotiation between who you are and who you have somehow been told you should be. You know this moment even if you have never named it. Most women do. Tonight, we are going to follow a thread that stretches back much further than you might expect. A thread that runs through the medicine cabinets of 1950s housewives, through the examining rooms of doctors who prescribed without question, through the pharmaceutical boardrooms where weight became a market, and through the slow, quiet understanding that what was sold as medicine was sometimes something much older and much stranger than that. A story about what women were given to help them disappear, just slightly, just enough, and what that cost them in the end. Settle in now, let the room hold you. This is a story best heard in the dark in the hour before sleep when the mind is soft enough to hold history gently. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. Before the prescription, there was the feeling. And before the feeling, there was the culture that taught women what they were supposed to feel about their own bodies. A culture so thorough, so omnipresent, so perfectly embedded in the ordinary texture of daily life that it had become indistinguishable from common sense. This is where the story starts, not in the examining room, not at the pharmacy counter. In the much quieter place where the expectation was first absorbed, long before anyone had thought to medicate it. You're standing in a kitchen somewhere in the American Midwest, in the autumn of 1953. The linoleum is a cheerful pattern of yellow squares that has not yet worn through at the traffic points. There is a percolator on the counter, and the smell of coffee has reached every room in the house. Through the window, the neighbour's maple is turning, one slow leaf at a time, from green to the particular amber of an old photograph. A child's shoe sits abandoned at the edge of the porch. The radio in the living room is carrying the sound of something smooth and brass-heavy, the kind of sound that fills a house without demanding attention. It is, by almost any measure, a pleasant morning. There is nothing here that would register as trouble in the world's accounting of trouble, and yet the morning has already carried something that the radio and the coffee and the amber maple cannot quite neutralize. The mirror in the bedroom has already spoken. It spoke before you came downstairs. It said the same thing it has been saying for months now, and the months have folded themselves into years. And somewhere in all that quiet repetition, the voice in the mirror became indistinguishable from your own voice, from the voice you use to think with, from the voice that narrates your days. The thought is small. It is always small at first, a dress that fits differently than it did in the spring, a photograph from the family reunion that surprised you with its honesty, the camera, you noted, at an unflattering angle, a comment from a relative, delivered lightly, as relatives deliver things they mean more heavily than they intend to show. You're not unwell. You're not suffering in any dramatic sense. There is no word for what you are feeling that the era would offer you without embarrassment. But something is there, in the specific and persistent space between who you are and who the culture says a woman should be at this particular moment in history. And that space, however small it seems in description, has a way of growing in the quiet. The 1950s were a decade of surfaces. This is understood now in retrospect with a clarity that living inside an era never quite permits. But surfaces were everything. The gleaming kitchen, the pressed shirt, the organised smile presented to the husband at the door when he returned from the commute. The garden maintained to a standard that the neighbours could assess. Women were expected to be the architecture of the household, not simply inhabitants of it, but its very structure, its internal logic, its visible evidence that everything was in order. An architecture, in that particular era, with its particular aesthetic confidence, had a very specific shape. The hourglass was not a metaphor in 1953, it was closer to a specification. Designers spoke openly and with remarkable precision about the ideal measurements of a woman's body, measurements that had been settled as though by some committee that nobody could quite locate, as though the human form were a proposal to be refined rather than a life to be lived. Christian Dior's new look of 1947 had established the template with the authority that only fashion can exercise. Nipped waist, full skirt, rounded shoulder, the body organised around a central narrowing that signalled above all control. The fashion magazines, the film studios, the advertisements in every newspaper and in the breaks of every radio programme, all of them agreed, with the confident unanimity of people who never questioned their authority to agree, this is what a woman looks like when she has done it right. Women, surrounded on all sides by that unanimity, took it in. Not passively, not without resistance, but thoroughly. The way you take in anything you're exposed to from the time you're old enough to recognise your own reflection, not as an external opinion, but as internal fact. The standard was absorbed the way language is absorbed. Without a moment you can point to as the moment of acquisition, it simply becomes part of how you think. What is worth understanding, holding carefully and from as much distance as the mind can manage, is that the expectation was not purely aesthetic in the way that the word aesthetic might suggest, as though it were a matter of taste, of preference, of the harmless decorating of reality. It was moral. Thinness in post-war America carried a freight of meaning that extended far beyond dress sizes or the swimsuit photographs in women's magazines. A slender body signalled self-discipline. It signalled that you were managing yourself, governing yourself, keeping yourself in order against the body's natural tendency to expand. A woman who had maintained her figure had demonstrated something about her character, in the particular way that the post-war cultural consensus understood character, as the visible external evidence of invisible internal effort. And a woman who had not maintained it, who had allowed herself to expand beyond the accepted outline, whose body had moved outside the specification, had failed, in some wordless but universally understood way, to perform her function. Not failed dramatically, not failed in a way that would be named at a dinner party or written in a letter, but failed in the ambient, pervasive, unspoken way of someone who is perpetually slightly behind on a social obligation that everyone pretends does not exist while everyone enforces it. This is not a comfortable history to sit inside, but it is important to hold it steadily, with as much gentleness as we can, because it helps explain what came next with a clarity that the simpler narratives, the ones that cast the pharmaceutical industry as simply predatory, or the prescribing physicians as simply negligent, do not fully provide. When doctors began prescribing amphetamines to women who wanted to lose weight, they were not inventing something new. They were medicating something that was already there, a pressure that had lived in women's bodies for years, in some cases decades, before any prescription pad was involved. The pressure had its own long history, and that history predated the 1950s by considerably more than a few decades. Women had been advised, coaxed, measured, corrected, corseted, lectured, and sometimes punished around the question of their bodies for as long as there had been cultural standards to measure those bodies against, which is to say, for as long as recorded history reaches. What changed in the post-war era was not the existence of the pressure, but the form it took and, crucially, the delivery mechanism through which its relief was offered. What changed was that medicine arrived, in its white coat and its stethoscope and its particular cultural authority, and said, "I can help with this." There is something in that offer, something in the specific quality of it, that matters for everything that follows, because when a magazine tells you that you should be thinner, the magazine is selling something, and you know it is selling something, and the knowledge of the selling provides at least a scrim of critical distance between you and what you are being told. When a doctor tells you the same thing and offers to treat it, the relationship is fundamentally different. The doctor is not selling, the doctor is helping, and helping carries a different kind of weight in the cultural accounting, a weight that implies that the thing being helped with is real, is medical, is sufficiently serious to have clinical management. The prescription pad in 1953 was a powerful instrument. It turned a woman's desire to be smaller into a legitimate condition. It turned appetite into a symptom, and in doing so, without drama, without any particular announcement of what was happening, it began one of the quieter and more consequential chapters in the history of American medicine, a chapter whose effects would take decades to fully understand and longer still to adequately address. There were, of course, women who were less captured by this pressure than others, women who had arrived at a comfortable relationship with their bodies through luck, or upbringing, or temperament, or some combination of all three, women who moved through the decade with a greater distance from its ideals, who had made some private peace with the shape they were in. But even they were not untouched. Even they had to navigate a world that spoke constantly and specifically about the female body as a thing to be managed, a project always ongoing. The ambient noise of that decade was very loud on this particular subject, and it took something, a certain resilience, a certain luck, a certain kind of family or inner life, to hear it for years without being changed by it. Most women were changed by it. This is not an indictment. It is simply the nature of long exposure to a pervasive standard. The standard settled in them the way that all deeply absorbed standards settle, not as a belief you can identify and argue with, but as a fact you inhabit. A fact that lives in the body, in the specific feeling in the chest when the scale shows a number higher than expected, in the particular way of looking and not looking at the mirror. And when the doctors arrived with their prescription pads, those women were not merely willing to accept what was offered. They had been prepared to need it. For years before the pill arrived, the culture had been laying its groundwork. The name for what was coming, the pharmaceutical name, the chemical name, was amphetamine. The women who would receive it mostly did not call it that. They called it their diet pills, their prescription, their little helpers, what the doctor gave them. The name did not matter much in the immediate experience of it. What mattered was that the pills worked. For a time, undeniably, they worked. And in the time that they worked, something happened inside millions of women's bodies and millions of women's lives that would take much longer than the prescription years to understand. The morning in the yellow linoleum kitchen continues. The coffee has gone slightly cool. The maple has dropped another 2 leaves while you are not watching. The day is still early, and somewhere above the kitchen, in the medicine cabinet that smells faintly of talcum powder and rose soap, there is or will be a small orange bottle with a typed label and a doctor's name. The day it arrived, the day the label was first typed and the cap first opened, was a day that looked, from the inside, like an ordinary day. Those are usually the important ones. The waiting room. She is sitting in a chair with a magazine on her lap. The waiting room is warm and smells of something institutional, floor cleaner perhaps, or the particular paper of the magazines, or the specific quality of air that develops in spaces where people sit and wait for permission to enter the next room. She's wearing her good dress. The appointment is in about 15 minutes. She's been thinking, on the drive here, about what she will say, and what the physician will say, and whether the visit will go the way she hopes. The waiting room in a physician's office in 1959 was a specific kind of space. It was a transitional space, between the ordinary world and the medical world, between the self that existed in the daily life and the self that was about to be assessed clinically, between the question and whatever answer the visit would produce. The chairs were typically arranged along the walls. The magazines on the table were from several weeks ago, the news in them already dated. The other patients sat at careful distances, maintaining the privacy that the space could not quite provide, each one engaged in the specific interior preparation that a physician's visit requires. The waiting room is where the decision was still forming. By the time she sat in the examining room with the physician across the desk, the conversation had a momentum that would be difficult to redirect. But here, in the chairs with the magazines, there was still a kind of openness. The visit had not yet happened. The prescription had not yet been offered. The weight had not yet been noted in the chart with the physician's particular expression, that careful neutrality that conveyed assessment without judgment, or without judgment that could be named at least. What was she hoping for, this woman in her good dress? She was hoping for something that the visit in many cases did provide, to be taken seriously, to have her discomfort about her body received as a real concern rather than a vanity, to be offered something practical, something with the authority of medicine behind it, something that transformed the private struggle with the mirror and the scale into a clinical matter with a clinical solution. This was not a small hope. It was, in the specific cultural context of 1959, a reasonable hope, the hope that the physician would have something to offer, and that what was offered would help. The physician did have something to offer. The prescription was written, the instructions were given, the return appointment was scheduled. She left through the same waiting room she had entered. past the chairs where other women were still waiting, down the corridor and through the main door and into the afternoon. The prescription was in her purse. The appointment had gone the way she'd hoped, or close enough. She felt, leaving, the specific lightness of a plan in place, the relief of having moved from uncertainty to action, from the private struggle to the managed program. The lightness would last a while. The pills would work in the specific way that amphetamines work. The appetite suppressing, the energy lifting, the mornings becoming more manageable in their particular amphetamine manner. The dress might fit by June, as she had hoped. The scale number would move in the direction she wanted it to move. All of this would happen. The waiting room's promise would be kept for a time. What the waiting room could not tell her was what would come after. The dependency that developed so gradually that it did not register as dependency until the morning she tried to manage without the pill and found that the morning was heavier than it should have been. The conversation with her physician months later when she said she thought she needed to stop, and the physician said perhaps, and perhaps adjusted the dose rather than discontinuing, because discontinuing felt premature, because the weight loss was ongoing, because the logic of the prescription was still intact even when the woman's instinct was that something had changed. The long taper, eventually, through the early 1970s when the regulatory landscape shifted and the prescribing practice became more scrutinized and the pills became harder to get. The return of the weight and the return of the mornings and the specific quality of the mornings after amphetamines that is different from any mornings that came before. The waiting room does not know any of this. The waiting room is just a room. The chairs are just chairs. The magazine on her lap is open to a page about summer entertaining, and she is not reading it. She's thinking about the appointment, 15 minutes away, and the specific hope she's carrying toward it. The hope is real. The hope is hers. And the system she's about to enter, with its specific incentives and its specific knowledge and its specific blindnesses, will receive the hope and respond to it in the only way it knows how. Millions of women sat in waiting rooms like this one, in the chairs with the old magazines, with the appointments 15 minutes away, with the hopes they had driven here carrying. They were not the same woman. They came from different places and had different lives and carried different versions of the same hope. What they shared was the specific vulnerability of the waiting room, the particular openness of a person who has not yet received the thing they came for, who is still between the question and the answer, who is trusting that the answer will be worth the waiting. The waiting room is a recurring image in the history of medicine and in the history of women's relationship to medicine specifically. It recurs because the space it represents, the space of waiting for institutional response to personal need, of trusting that the institution has what the need requires, is a space that medicine has filled with different things in different eras, with varying degrees of success and varying degrees of harm. The waiting room is always hopeful. What happens in the room beyond it is what the history is made of. She turns a page of the magazine. The article on the page is about a new kind of kitchen appliance, and she registers it only peripherally. The waiting has a particular quality to it that she will remember later, though she will not always know why she remembers it. The specific light, the specific warm institutional smell, the specific feeling of being at the threshold of something, the prescription in her purse, not yet written, the morning in June, not yet arrived, everything still open, still possible, still waiting to become what it will become. The shape of a century. The history of what Western culture has wanted from women's bodies is not a straight line. It turns and doubles back and revises itself every few decades with the confident amnesia of fashion, as though the previous ideal had never existed, as though the current one had always been obvious. Sitting with that history for a moment, really sitting with it, letting it become more than a sequence of decades and silhouettes, is one of the ways to understand how thoroughly the pressure that produced the prescription years was built into the landscape long before the first pill was formulated. You're standing in a department store in 1920. The year is precise because something is shifting right now in this very season, in what a woman is expected to look like. The corset, that instrument of the previous century, that cage of whalebone and cotton lacing that had for decades compressed the female torso into a shape that the body had not produced naturally, is losing its cultural authority. Not its existence, not yet, but its grip on the imagination of what femininity should look like. The corset is becoming associated with the previous century's rigidity, and the new century wants something else. What it wants, in 1920, is the flapper silhouette. And the flapper silhouette is, in certain ways, a genuine revolution. It freed women from specific mechanical constraints. The rigid undergarment went away, the heavy petticoats went away, movement became possible in a way it had not been for generations. Women could breathe more fully, they could dance, specifically, in the new ways that the decade was inventing. They could move through the world without the armature of an earlier era's expectations literally encasing them. But the body that was free to move was expected to look a very particular way, and that particular way was boyish, angular, flat-chested, slight. The curvature that the corset had once manufactured, the artificial hourglass of the corseted Victorian, was now simply unwanted. And so women began to bind their chests and restrict their eating, and manage their bodies in the direction of an outline that was, in its own way, just as precisely specified as the corset's outcome had been. The form of the management changed, the fact of the management continued. What had changed was not the pressure, what had changed was its direction. The corset had imposed an artificial shape over whatever body a woman actually had. The 1920s removed the corset and demanded that the body itself become something different. This was, in certain ways, a more fundamental ask. The corset could be unlaced at the end of the day, the body could not. The thin, boyish body of 1925 was expected to persist through the night, and the morning, and the season, and the year, maintained by continuous effort rather than by a garment that could be removed. The detail worth sitting with, the one that matters for understanding the century's arc, is that thinness as a beauty ideal in Western culture is, historically speaking, a relatively recent invention. For most of human history, across most of the cultures that left records, fullness was beauty. Softness was wealth. A rounded body was a body that was fed, that was warm, that had enough, that had access to the resources that the precarious world of earlier centuries so often withheld. In medieval European painting, in Renaissance portraiture, in the beauty standards that governed the centuries before the 20th, arrived with its cameras and its mass reproduction, and its enormously amplified distribution of images, the female body that was admired was generous, present, substantial in the way that living things are substantial. The shift toward thinness, as the feminine ideal, has been traced by historians to roughly the late 19th century, gathering force through the early 20th and accelerating dramatically with the invention of mass photography and, later, film. The camera had effects on the cultural standard of beauty that were genuinely transformative and genuinely unplanned. The camera captured images that could be reproduced at scale and distributed to audiences of a size that no previous visual medium had achieved. And in those reproduced images, a particular body type, the type that photographed most clearly, most in accordance with the conventions of framing and light that early photographers were developing, became legible as the standard, and that type happened to be thin. This was not and cannot be accurately described as a conspiracy. It was not that someone sat in a room and decided that women should henceforth be smaller. It is more diffuse than that, and in some ways more troubling, because diffusion is harder to name and harder to refuse. The standard arose from the collision of technology and commerce and convention, from what cameras could capture and what clothing manufacturers could standardize, and what film studios could project onto screens and what audiences, seeing those screens generation after generation, absorbed as normal. The standard was not imposed from a single point, it was diffused from every point simultaneously. And diffusion, as anyone who has lived inside a culture knows, is more thorough than imposition. By the time the Second World War ended and the extraordinary prosperity of the post-war years began to fill the American suburbs with young families and new appliances and a giddy sense that the future was something to be actively enjoyed, the ideal of female thinness was settled doctrine. It did not need to be argued. It did not need to be defended. It was simply there, the way deeply absorbed standards are always there, not as a belief that could be examined and evaluated, but as a fact that was simply inhabited, the way you inhabit a room without thinking about what it would be to inhabit a different one. The specific ideal of the 1950s was not simply thin, however. It was the hourglass, full bust, narrow waist, full hips, a silhouette that required for most natural human bodies significant management. The girdle was the management. Foundation garments, support wear, The infrastructure of underclothing that was expected to reshape what nature had provided into something more acceptably curved, and beneath the girdle, beneath the careful dressing and the precise maintenance, was the same old anxiety about the body itself. The anxiety that the body, left to its own devices, would expand beyond the acceptable and become a source of the particular shame that excess weight carried in the 1950s cultural ledger. Anxiety about the body, about its tendency to not cooperate with the standard, to resist the management, to require continuous effort to maintain within acceptable parameters, was, by the mid-1950s, finding its way into doctors' offices in significant numbers, not because there was anything medically wrong with the women presenting it, but because medicine, in that era, was expanding its scope, was becoming more ambitious about the range of human experiences it could address, and because women's anxiety about their weight was a presenting problem that medicine could, by the mid-1950s, offer something for. The offer was the prescription, and the prescription was not simply a response to medical need. It was a response to a cultural preparation so thorough that the medical need had been, in a sense, manufactured by the culture before it arrived at the medicine. The women who sat in those examining rooms in 1955 and 1957 and 1959 were not pretending. They were not being dramatic. They were reporting, with complete sincerity, the genuine distress that the gap between their actual bodies and the culture's required bodies had produced in them. That distress was real. The question, which the era was not well positioned to ask, was whether the distress was best understood as a medical condition or as a cultural consequence. The answer, it turns out, has profound implications for what the correct response is. There is something worth sitting with in the history of this cultural pressure. These standards were not experienced by most of the women inside them primarily as oppression. They were experienced as reality, as the way things were. This is not false consciousness in any simple sense. It is the nature of deeply embedded cultural expectation. Some women pushed against the standards, quietly or loudly, and found different ways of inhabiting their bodies. But many women, most women perhaps, experienced the standard as simply the truth about bodies. The true body was controlled. The true body was managed. And any body that was not these things was a body in a kind of ongoing problem, a body that needed attention. When medicine arrived with the capacity to address that attention, to provide a clinical solution to what the culture had defined as a clinical problem, it arrived not as an imposition from outside, but as an answer to something women already felt, already lived with, already understood as a legitimate concern. This is why the story of the prescription years is not a story of women being tricked. The word tricked implies a simple deception, a straightforward mismatch between what was promised and what was known. What happened was more complex than that, more thoroughly structural. A culture built the receptiveness, and then the medicine arrived, and the medicine addressed the receptiveness, and the harm came later, and the harm was real and the receptiveness was real, and neither the one nor the other was simple. The shape of a century is always more complicated than the silhouette it projects. Behind every outline that the era declares ideal, there are the forces that produced the declaration, commercial, technological, social, political, and the forces that enforced it, and the forces that resisted it, and the people who were caught in the middle of all of them, trying to live their lives. The women of the 1950s were caught in the middle of a particular set of those forces at a particular historical moment. What happened to them was shaped by forces that preceded them by decades. What it cost them would take decades more to become fully visible. The shape of the century, when you trace it all the way through, is not an hourglass. It is something more irregular, more honest, more human than that. The weight of numbers. The scale in the bathroom has a history. Not the specific scale, not any particular bathroom scale in any particular house, but the practice of weighing oneself, of reducing the complex and living reality of the human body to a number, and then regarding that number with a specific kind of attention that cultures reserve for things that matter morally, not just practically. The practice is old. The idea that a number could capture something essential about a body, about the body's adequacy, its management, its discipline, its worthiness, is a cultural invention that became so thoroughly embedded in the 20th century that it stopped being visible as an invention at all. The bathroom scale for home use was not widely available until the early 20th century. Before that, Weighing required a visit to a pharmacy or a doctor's office, or a public scale at the market, a scale that was used for sacks of grain and bolts of cloth and occasionally for people who wanted to know their weight. The weighing of people was, before the 20th century, not a routine part of medical practice. Physicians examined bodies in other ways, by observation, by palpation, by asking questions about symptoms. The number on the scale was a specific kind of medical information that required the existence of scales in examining rooms and the clinical decision to use them as diagnostic tools before it could become part of the medical encounter. The Metropolitan Life Insurance Company played an unexpected role in the history of weight as a medical concern. Beginning in the 1940s and developing through the 1950s, Metropolitan Life published what it called the ideal weight tables, charts that correlated height and body frame size with what the company identified as the weight most associated with longevity in its actuarial data. The tables were based on the company's insurance data, the weights and health outcomes of the people who had purchased life insurance, and they were presented with the authority of statistical analysis. They were not presented as aesthetic standards. They were presented as health standards. This is the weight at which people in your height and frame category tend to live longest. The Metropolitan Life tables became widely influential. They were cited in medical literature. They were reprinted in women's magazines. They were used by physicians as clinical reference points for discussing weight with patients. They were used by women to assess their own bodies against an external standard that had the authority of both medicine and insurance actuarial science behind it. The tables were, in the culture of the post-war era, the facts about weight. Not a fashion preference, not a cultural aspiration, but a scientific determination of the correct weight for a given body type. The tables had significant limitations that were not always visible in their presentation. The insurance population on which they were based was not a representative sample of the general population. It was a self-selected group of people who had been assessed as insurable by the company's underwriting process, which already filtered for certain health characteristics. The correlation between weight and longevity in this population was real, but could not be straightforwardly generalized to populations with different characteristics, different health histories, different economic and social circumstances. The cause and effect relationship between weight and longevity was assumed rather than demonstrated. The tables showed correlation, which was being presented as prescription. None of these limitations was prominently featured in the presentation of the tables to the public. What was prominently featured was the number, "Here is your ideal weight. Here is the weight at which you, statistically, will live longest." And behind this presentation, invisible but structurally embedded, was the commercial interest of the insurance company in having its customers live long enough to pay premiums, but not so long as to collect benefits in excess of what the actuarial assumptions had predicted. The tables were, in part, a product of the insurance industry's financial interests, presented as a neutral statement of biological fact. This is not to say the tables were pure fabrication. The correlation between weight and certain health outcomes is real and has been confirmed by subsequent research. But the correlation is more complex than the table suggested, is more variable across populations, is more dependent on other health factors than the weight alone, and is certainly not as cleanly deterministic as the table's presentation implied. The gap between the complexity of the relationship and the simplicity of the presentation was a gap into which the cultural pressure could insert itself, could take the number on the table and the number on the scale and create the moral urgency that drove women to the physician's office and made them receptive to what the physician offered. The BMI, as noted elsewhere in this story, arrived as a similar kind of quantification, a number that reduced the complexity of the body to a single figure and then sorted people into categories with associated health implications. The BMI's inventor, Adolf Kettler, was explicit that he had not designed the measure for individual health assessment. He was interested in describing statistical populations. The measure was adopted for individual assessment anyway, because individual assessment required a simple number, and the BMI was simple, and the simplicity was more useful clinically than the accuracy was. The clinical utility of a number that was not designed for individual assessment was real. It allowed quick categorization, it provided a common language, it permitted comparison across large populations. The cost was the loss of the individual complexity that the number was representing as a category. The number became the self. in the specific way that numbers become selves when they carry enough moral weight. A woman who weighed what the Metropolitan Life Table said she should weigh was a woman who was managing herself correctly. A woman who weighed more than the table said was a woman who was failing to manage, regardless of her blood pressure, her energy levels, her relationship with food, her overall health, her genetics, her life circumstances. The number on the scale was the verdict. The verdict was delivered every morning in private in the space between waking and getting dressed. And the verdict, because it was delivered every morning for years, became part of the internal vocabulary of self-assessment in ways that were much harder to revise than any external standard could be revised. The physician's scale in the examining room was the official version of the bathroom scale. It had the weight of medical authority behind it. When the physician noted the number on the scale in the medical chart, the number became part of the official record, documented, legitimized, available for comparison at the next visit. The physician's comment on the number was read against the background of the Metropolitan Life Tables, or their successors. This number is above your ideal, the physician might say, and the word ideal carried all of the weight of the tables and all of the weight of the culture that had made those tables into medical doctrine. What is worth understanding about the scale, about the practice of measuring bodies in numbers and comparing those numbers to standards, is how recently it became central to women's relationship with their own bodies, and how thoroughly, in the decades of its reign, it colonized that relationship. Women before the bathroom scale era were not free of cultural pressure around their bodies, but the pressure was mediated differently, through clothing fit, through the mirror, through social comparison. The scale added a specific kind of precision and a specific kind of authority. The number, unlike the mirror, could not be argued with. The number was the number. The prescription years were, in this sense, a direct consequence of the scale years. The scale established the quantified deficit. You are this many pounds above where you should be, and the physician offered the quantified correction. This medication will produce this weight loss over this time period. The entire transaction was framed in numbers, which gave it the quality of precision and of scientific management that the era valued. The woman was not being judged aesthetically, she was being managed medically. The distinction was maintained by the numbers, which made the whole enterprise feel more like engineering than like fashion, more like health than like vanity. The numbers, of course, were not neutral. They were produced by scales that were calibrated to a standard that was itself produced by cultural decisions about what weight meant. They were interpreted through tables that were produced by commercial entities with their own interests. They were used in clinical conversations shaped by the same cultural assumptions that had shaped the women's magazines and the fashion industry. The numbers were the culture's representation of itself in a form that felt more objective than the culture. They were the aspiration wearing a white coat. In the morning you step on the scale. This is a moment that did not exist for most women before about 1920. It is now so thoroughly embedded in the morning routine that it is difficult to imagine a morning without it. The number arrives. The day responds to the number in ways that are felt but not always articulated. The mirror, which was there before the scale, has been joined by the scale's verdict. Together they constitute the morning's assessment, and the morning's assessment has been constituting the day's foundation for most of a century. The history of that morning, the history of how the number became the verdict and the verdict became the morning, is part of the history of everything that followed, including the prescription. Benzodrine and the doctor's promise. Amphetamine did not begin as a diet drug. It began as several other things entirely, moving through different eras and different crises and different intended purposes before it arrived, in the medicine cabinet of the 1950s housewife, as the solution to the problem of her body. The journey from laboratory curiosity to prescription weight loss aid is not a straight line, but it has a logic shaped by war, by commerce, by the particular relationship that American medicine developed with stimulant compounds across the middle decades of the 20th century. The compound was first synthesized in 1887 by a Romanian chemist named Lazar Ideleanu, who was working in Berlin on a different question entirely. He was interested in the chemical properties of ephedrine's structural relatives, and he produced amphetamine as part of a broader investigation. The substance was noted in his research notes and then set aside, as many chemical curiosities are, to wait for someone else to find a use for it. It would wait 40 years. That someone arrived in 1927, in the form of an American pharmacologist named Gordon Alice, who was searching for a synthetic substitute for ephedrine, a decongestant extracted from the Chinese plant mahuang and used in Western medicine primarily for asthma and hay fever. Ephedrine worked but was expensive to produce. Alice was looking for something cheaper and synthetic that would act on the same physiological pathways. What he found was not quite ephedrine, but it affected the nasal passages and the bronchial tubes in a similar way. He called it amphetamine, from its chemical name, alpha-methylphenethylamine. He noted its stimulant properties in his research. He licensed the compound to Smith, Kline and French. Smith, Kline and French began marketing amphetamine in 1934 under the trade name Benzedrine. Its first form was an inhaler, a small cardboard tube about the size of a finger, folded inside with strips of paper soaked in amphetamine oil. The intended use was nasal decongestion. You opened the tube, held it under a nostril and breathed in. The decongestant effect was rapid and effective. The cost was modest. Benzedrine inhalers were sold in pharmacies across the country without a prescription, sitting on the same shelves as aspirin and camphor rub, available to anyone with 15 cents and a stuffy nose. What happened next was predictable in retrospect, though it surprised the company at the time. People discovered that you could open the Benzedrine inhaler and swallow the paper strip inside it, and that what followed was not nasal decongestion, but something considerably more interesting. The mood lifted. The fatigue disappeared. The hours became longer and more productive. The world sharpened slightly at its edges. Thoughts arrived quickly and connected in satisfying ways. Students who needed to stay awake through examinations began using them. Writers discovered they could work through the night. Long-distance truck drivers found they could maintain alertness on routes that would otherwise require sleep stops. The word spread the way word spreads about useful things, person to person, quietly and with enthusiasm. The military connection that would shape everything that came later began to develop in the late 1930s and accelerated with the approach of the Second World War. The British Royal Air Force was among the first military organisations to adopt amphetamine systematically, distributing Benzedrine tablets to bomber command crews on long-range missions, where alertness was the difference between mission success and catastrophic error. The German military developed their own formulation, Pervitin, methamphetamine, which was issued to soldiers in the Western campaign in sufficient quantities to raise concerns among German military physicians about dependency, even during the war itself. The Japanese distributed Philipon. The Americans issued Benzedrine. 50 to 72 million Benzedrine tablets were issued to American troops during the Second World War, not as prescription medications, as standard-issue supplies distributed alongside rations and boots and ammunition, for the straightforward reason that sleep-deprived and frightened soldiers were less effective in combat, and amphetamines addressed both the sleepiness and, to some degree, the fear. The drug suppressed appetite, allowed sustained physical effort over periods that would normally require rest, elevated mood, and produced a temporary but real increase in perceived capability. For the purposes of war, these were features, not bugs. The war ended in 1945. The soldiers came home. The pharmaceutical infrastructure that had produced those 72 million tablets did not dismantle itself. The factories, the supply chains, the chemical knowledge, the production capacity, all of it remained. And the knowledge of the drug's effects, including its capacity to suppress appetite and elevate mood and maintain energy through tasks that would otherwise be exhausting, had been distributed widely, not just in the medical and scientific literature, but in the common experience of men who had taken it for years, and women who had watched them, and in the culture's general awareness that something powerful and mood-altering and chemically interesting had come back from the war. The prescription of amphetamines for weight loss in civilian women is usually dated to the early 1950s, though the practice began somewhat earlier and developed through a gradual accumulation of individual clinical decisions rather than any single moment of policy. Doctors knew the drug suppressed appetite. This was pharmacologically obvious and clinically documented. Women wanted to suppress their appetites. This was culturally obvious and clinically presented in examining rooms across the country, in numbers that grew steadily through the late 1940s and into the 1950s. The logic connecting these two facts required no elaborate justification. The trade name Dexedrine, dextroamphetamine, a more refined and more potent version of the original compound, entered the market in 1950 and became one of the primary forms in which the drug was prescribed to women for weight management. There was also methamphetamine, sold under the brand name Desoxin, which was prescribed for obesity and depression and a range of other conditions. The distinctions between these compounds were pharmacological and relatively technical. Their effects on the women who took them were broadly similar. What varied was the dose, the duration, and the clinical context. And the clinical context was, in most cases, the ordinary examining room of the ordinary family physician, not a specialist clinic or a research institution. You're in that examining room now in 1957. The chair is upholstered in a dark green vinyl that holds the cold of the room. There is a paper covering on the examining table that crinkles when anyone shifts on it. A glass-fronted cabinet holds bottles and instruments that you have never had occasion to examine closely. The doctor has the particular efficiency of men in positions of unquestioned authority in that era. Efficient, unhurried, in a way that communicates control rather than patience, possessed of a confidence that does not think to ask permission for itself. He has examined your weight. He has noted it in a chart that you cannot read from where you're sitting. He has listened to your complaint, that you cannot seem to lose the weight you gained during the last pregnancy, that the dress for the cousin's wedding in June is not quite fitting, that you've tried dieting and found it difficult to sustain through the weeks when things are busy. He nods, he writes. The examination takes perhaps 7 minutes. He writes you a prescription. 30 pills, refillable, 1 in the morning before breakfast with water. The prescription is a rectangle of paper with his name printed at the top, and a typed instruction and a signature at the bottom. It is not a dramatic object. It is simply a piece of paper that he has produced in the course of providing medical care. The way medical care has always produced such objects. You fold it and put it in your handbag. What the prescription does not say, what nothing in the examining room has said in any of the 7 minutes, is that the compound it authorizes is related, at the level of basic chemistry, to the substance that kept your husband alert during night operations in the Pacific. It does not say that the drug acts on the central nervous system in ways that have been producing dependency in a small but significant percentage of users since the late 1930s. It does not say what happens when you stop. The doctor is not hiding these things. He genuinely believes, and has been told by the pharmaceutical literature and the detail man who visited his office last month, that the drug is safe in the doses prescribed for weight management. He is providing what he understands to be appropriate care. He is doing his job. The drive home from his office takes 12 minutes. You stop at the pharmacy. The pharmacist fills the prescription and puts it in a small bag with the receipt. You drive the rest of the way home. The coffee from this morning is still on the counter, cold now. The mail has arrived and sits on the table. The afternoon has its ordinary requirements, and on the kitchen counter, next to the coffee pot, is a small orange bottle that contains something that will, in the months ahead, change the texture of your days in ways you have not yet imagined, in some ways for the better, in some ways in ways that will take considerably longer to understand. The bottle is small. The change will not be. What the magazines told women. Before the pill, there was the magazine. The magazine arrived every month or every week, and it carried inside it a world of specifically calibrated aspiration. The women's magazines of the post-war era are among the most revealing documents of the culture that produced the prescription years. They are revealing not primarily because of what they said explicitly, though what they said explicitly is instructive, but because of what they assumed. What they assumed about what women wanted, about what women needed, about what the right life for a woman looked like, and about what the obstacles to that right life were. You are looking at a women's magazine from 1956. The cover features a woman whose smile and whose figure are both perfectly composed, the smile and the figure both expressing the same fundamental message, that the right life produces this, and that the right life is available, and that the magazine can help you get there. The inside contains articles about cooking and decorating, and the management of the social calendar, about the care of children and the management of the husband's requirements, about the correct approach to guests and the correct approach to the holiday table, and the correct approach to the question of one's appearance as the years accumulate. The appearance is covered in several registers. There is the fashion coverage, which shows clothing and explains how to wear it, and which bodies wear it best. There is the beauty coverage, which addresses the face and the hair and the skin, the maintenance of a particular visual presentation that requires consistent effort and specific products. And then there is the figure coverage, which is the coverage that concerns us most directly here. The figure coverage was a genre with its own conventions, its own vocabulary, its own specific relationship to the reader that was different from the other registers of women's magazine content. The figure coverage did several things simultaneously. It offered practical advice, exercises, dietary suggestions, the best undergarments for various figure challenges. It offered aspiration, the body that could be achieved with the right combination of effort and product and, increasingly, medical assistance. It offered community. The reader was not alone in her concern with her figure. Millions of women were navigating the same terrain, and the magazine was the shared space in which the navigation was discussed, and it offered, embedded in all of these other things, the fundamental premise without which none of the practical advice would have been necessary: that the figure was a project, that the project required management, that the management was the responsibility of the individual woman, and that failure to manage successfully was a personal rather than a cultural failure. The advertising within the figure coverage section was dense and specific. Products for slimming, products for shaping, products that promised to do chemically or mechanically what the exercises promised to do through effort. The language of the advertising was the language of transformation, before and after, the journey from less to more, the self that waited on the other side of the right product's correct application. The transformation was never permanent. It required continued purchase of the transforming product. But the temporariness was not foregrounded. What was foregrounded was the transformation itself, and the woman who had achieved it, and the life that the transformation had made available to her. The pharmaceutical advertising began to appear in women's magazines in the early 1960s, as the regulatory environment began to allow more direct-to-consumer advertising of prescription-adjacent products, and as the diet pill market developed sufficient commercial mass to support mass-market advertising. The pharmaceutical advertising was careful about the prescription requirement. It could not openly advertise Dexedrine by name to consumers without running into regulatory issues, but it could advertise the concept of medical assistance with weight management, could direct women to speak with their physicians about what options might be available, could frame weight as a medical concern that deserved medical attention. The framing was, from a marketing standpoint, sophisticated. By placing weight in a medical frame within the pages of a women's magazine, the advertising was doing something specific. It was adding the authority of medicine to the existing authority of fashion and beauty standards to create a doubled mandate. You should be thinner because it is beautiful was already operating. You should be thinner because it is healthy added something new. The legitimacy of the clinical, the imprimatur of science, the suggestion that what was previously an aesthetic concern was also a medical one. The addition made the concern harder to set aside. You could argue with aesthetic standards, at least in principle, at least with significant effort. You could not so easily argue with health. The women's magazines of the 1950s and 1960s were carrying, page by page and issue by issue, the cultural content that made the pharmaceutical market possible. They were not doing this cynically. The editors and writers who produced the content were largely operating within the same framework of assumptions as the readers they were addressing. The assumptions were the water they swam in. The assumption that women's bodies required management, that the management was individual rather than structural, that the products and practices the magazine described were appropriate responses to a real and legitimate concern. These were not perspectives that required defense in 1956. They were simply the obvious truth about what it meant to be a woman in the world. The magazines also, it is worth noting, carried early versions of the critique. Not the systematic critique that would develop in the late 1960s and 1970s, the feminist critique, the body politics critique, the critique that identified the beauty standard as a tool of social control rather than a neutral aesthetic preference. But quieter, earlier, less systematic expressions of ambivalence about the whole enterprise. A columnist who noted, in an aside, that the editors did not remove, that the pursuit of the perfect figure was perhaps taking up energy that might be spent in other directions. A reader's letter that expressed something more complicated than simple enthusiasm for the diet tips. A beauty editor who, in describing the latest exercise program, acknowledged that not every body would achieve the same results, and that perhaps that was acceptable. These were small moments, easily swamped by the larger current of the content around them, but they are there, in the archives, legible to the reader who is looking for them. They suggest that the cultural consensus was never as complete as it appeared from outside, that within the mainstream culture itself there were threads of questioning that the dominant framing routinely overwhelmed but could not entirely extinguish. The questioning would develop over the following decades into something substantial, but in 1956 it was still a thread. The magazine was arriving every month to women across the country, and they were reading it, and the reading was part of the ongoing education in what was expected of them. Not merely the explicit content, the recipes and the exercises and the diet advice, but the ambient message that this was the world a woman should want to live in, that this was the standard she should be trying to meet, that the gap between the life the magazine showed and the life she was actually living was something the magazine could help her close. The gap was the product. The magazine sold the gap as much as it sold the solutions to the gap. The solutions could only be sold if the gap was established first. The entire enterprise depended on the reader feeling at some level that she was not quite there yet, and that there was something she could do about it. This is the specific mechanism of a great deal of media that addresses women's appearance and bodies. It sells the aspiration and the anxiety simultaneously, because the anxiety is what makes the aspiration marketable. A woman who is entirely at peace with her body has no reason to buy the shaping undergarment or the diet pill or the exercise program. A woman who is not at peace has every reason. The magazine's commercial interest was aligned with the maintenance of the not-at-peace condition, and the maintenance of the condition was so thoroughly embedded in the magazine's content and culture that it did not register as a commercial interest at all. It registered as simply the truth about bodies, and about what it took to maintain them properly, and about what medicine and the market could offer to help. When you lay the women's magazine of 1956 next to the pharmaceutical marketing of the same era, and both next to the congressional testimony of the 1970s about what was being prescribed to women and why, a picture assembles itself that is coherent and disturbing. The magazine established the aspiration and the anxiety. The physician, formed in the same culture that produced the magazine, offered the pharmaceutical solution. The pharmaceutical company, operating in the same culture and with a commercial stake in the anxiety's persistence, marketed the solution to the physician. The loop was closed, and the women inside the loop, the readers of the magazine, the patients in the examining room, the consumers of the products and the prescriptions, were inside a system that was, at every point, reinforcing itself. The magazines are still there, in the archives. You can read them. They are in many cases beautifully produced. The photography is superb, the writing is competent, the design reflects the aesthetic confidence of its era. And they are, read from this distance, also something else, a record of what the culture was doing to women in the ordinary course of their consumption of the media that was supposed to be for them. Not violently, not dramatically, not with any intention of harm, simply through the patient, monthly reliable delivery of the message that they were not quite right, and that the right thing was available, and that the right thing was worth having, at whatever cost it required. The rainbow pills. By the late 1950s, the prescription of amphetamines for weight loss had developed beyond the single orange bottle and the morning pill taken with coffee. The market had developed an ecology of its own, a range of compounds, clinics, and clinical approaches that together constituted something more complex than a simple prescription practice. If you were a woman in a major American city in 1959, seeking medical assistance with your weight, you might encounter not a single drug but a carefully assembled collection of them, each one addressed to a different facet of the project. The collection had a name, though the women who took it did not always hear the name. It was called the Rainbow Diet. The rainbow name came from the colours. The pills came in different colours: pink, yellow, orange, blue, white, and each colour was a different compound with a different purpose and a different mechanism of action. Together they constituted, in the view of the clinics that dispensed them, a comprehensive pharmacological approach to the problem of weight. In the view of later analysis, they constituted one of the more concentrated examples of iatrogenic harm caused by medical treatment, in the history of post-war American medicine. The distinction between these two views is the distance between 1959 and now. There was typically an amphetamine in the rainbow. This was the centerpiece, the primary agent, the thing that suppressed appetite and elevated mood and made the project feel possible. But the amphetamine alone had side effects that were inconvenient for the domestic life the woman was expected to maintain while losing weight. Chiefly, it made sleeping difficult, and it made sitting still difficult, and a woman who could not sleep and could not sit still was a woman who could not easily maintain the quiet, available, present quality that the household and the husband expected. The stimulant solved the weight problem at the cost of creating a new problem. The solution to the new problem was another pill, typically a barbiturate or a benzodiazepine-adjacent compound, a sedative or tranquilizer that counteracted the stimulant's edge, that smoothed out the agitation and restored something closer to the even temper that was expected. This pill said, "Here is your calm back. Here is your ability to sleep. Here is the equanimity that the first pill took." And so the second pill addressed the side effects of the first in the way that pharmaceutical solutions often address each other's consequences, creating a chain that is longer than the original problem required. There was sometimes a diuretic to manage water retention, to make the scale move in the right direction on the days when the amphetamine's appetite suppression was not producing sufficient weight loss to maintain the patient's motivation. Water weight is not fat loss, and anyone with a basic understanding of human physiology knows this, but water weight loss produces a number on the scale that goes down, and the number going down produces the sense that the treatment is working, and the sense that the treatment is working produces continued compliance with the treatment. The diuretic served this purpose. There was, in some formulations, thyroid hormone. This is perhaps the most striking component of the rainbow in retrospect. Thyroid hormone given to women whose thyroid function was entirely normal, whose thyroids were producing precisely the amounts of hormone their bodies needed, was given specifically to accelerate the metabolic rate, to make the body burn energy faster than it naturally would. This is not a neutral intervention. The thyroid gland regulates metabolism across virtually every organ system. Giving exogenous thyroid hormone to a person who does not need it creates the physiological condition of hyperthyroidism, an accelerated state that, sustained over time, has real and measurable effects on the heart, the bones, and the nervous system. That the rainbow pill clinics dispensed thyroid hormone to normal thyroid women without apparent concern was not, in 1959, considered remarkable. It was considered a component of comprehensive weight management. The clinical framework within which these decisions were made did not yet have the understanding of thyroid physiology that subsequent decades would develop, and the women who were receiving the treatment did not have access to that understanding either. They were receiving what the clinic said was medicine. The clinic said it was medicine with confidence, in the language of clinical authority. The clinics that specialized in weight loss were a particular feature of this era, and they occupy a specific place in the history of American healthcare that deserves careful attention. They were not hospitals. They were not, in most cases, research institutions or academic medical centers. They were private offices, sometimes elegant, sometimes modest, sometimes franchised across cities in ways that anticipated later medical retail models, where a woman could come, pay a fee, and leave with a collection of prescriptions. The physical examination was not always rigorous. The follow-up was not always systematic. The monitoring of side effects was not always thorough. What was consistent was the outcome. You came in and you left with pills. What is striking, reading the medical literature and the patient accounts from this period alongside each other, is how little questioning occurred at the point of care. Not because the women involved were passive. They were not passive, are never passive, though the culture of that era made unquestioning compliance with medical authority a norm that few had the tools to step outside of. But because the framework for questioning was largely absent. The authority of the physician was near absolute in the examining room of the late 1950s. The patient's role was to receive the clinical assessment and follow the clinical recommendation. Asking probing questions about the pharmacology of a prescription was not a behavior that the culture had normalized or the medical system had facilitated. Some women did question, of course. Some women asked what the pills were, what they were doing, whether they were safe, and received answers that range from carefully reassuring to briskly dismissive. Some women stopped taking the pills on their own initiative when the side effects became impossible to ignore, or when some instinct told them that the relationship between themselves and the prescription was not right. These women exist in the historical record, and their stories are worth telling, but they are a minority of the documented accounts. The majority took the pills, continued taking them, went back for refills, and lived with the effects for months and years before the system around them began to register what was happening. The women who noticed things, the heart racing, the difficulty sleeping, the anxiety that had not been there before, the strange sense that the pills had become something they needed rather than something they chose, were women who were reporting what their bodies were plainly telling them. What they were not always equipped to do was interpret the report within a framework that named it accurately. The framework that would have been most useful, the framework of addiction medicine, of physiological dependency, of the specific mechanism by which amphetamines create the neurological conditions of dependence, was not available in the examining rooms of 1959. It was available in the research literature, in certain academic contexts, in some corners of the pharmacology literature. It was not available at the point of prescription. And so the experience of dependency was experienced by many women not as dependency, a word with implications they would not have accepted as applicable to themselves, but as need, as the sense that the pills were doing something necessary, something they could not manage without. The distinction between those two framings is less significant pharmacologically than it is socially and personally. Dependency named by its name is a condition that can be recognized, addressed, treated. Need is simply the experience of not having something that the body has come to require. Need is harder to get help for because it does not yet know it needs help. The rainbow pills by the late 1950s were being prescribed by a substantial number of American physicians to a substantial number of American women. The exact figures are difficult to establish because the prescribing was distributed across private practices and specialty clinics and was not systematically tracked. What is documentable is the production side. Amphetamine manufacture in the United States was expanding through the 1950s at a rate that cannot be explained by any legitimate medical use for the drugs. The production was meeting a demand, and the demand was being created by a prescribing practice that was, in the clinical consensus of the time, entirely acceptable. The colours of the pills, the pink and the yellow and the orange and the blue, are a small detail that carries a specific quality of the era. The pills were pretty, in the way that the decade liked its products to be. Neat, specific, colour-coded, suggestive of science through their differentiation. They came in bottles that fit in purses and in medicine cabinets. They fit into the domestic routine with the same ease as everything else that the decade asked women to manage. They were, in their way, perfectly designed for the women who would take them, compact, efficient, and arranged in such a way that the complexity of what they were doing inside the body was entirely invisible from the outside. The invisibility is important. The rainbow was private. It lived in the medicine cabinet and in the purse and in the schedule of the day. No one could see it working. No one could see what it was doing. And this invisibility was part of what made the dependency, when it came, so difficult to name and so easy to mistake for something else. The pills worked, for a while, and then they required, and then the requiring became the working, became the normal, became the condition of ordinary life. And the ordinary life continued, with its coffee pots and its school runs and its dinners on the table, and its mirror in the morning, and the pills were simply part of it, as quietly and thoroughly as anything can be that lives inside the daily routine without announcing itself. The pharmacist's counter. There was a person, in every town that had a pharmacy, who knew. Not everything. The pharmacist did not have access to the full clinical picture of any given patient, did not know the blood pressure readings or the family history, or the specifics of the conversation between the patient and her physician, but the pharmacist knew the prescription, knew the drug and the dose and the frequency and, over time, the pattern of refills. The pharmacist who filled a prescription for Dexedrine for a particular woman every 30 days, month after month for 3 years, knew something specific. That this woman was taking amphetamines continuously, at a consistent dose, with a consistency that in any other context would have been called a habit. The pharmacist occupied a peculiar position in the architecture of the prescription years. They were the last institutional point of contact between the pharmaceutical supply chain and the patient before the pills entered the body. They were trained in pharmacology in ways that many prescribing physicians of the era were not. The pharmacist's understanding of drug mechanisms, drug interactions, and the pharmacological basis of dependency was often more detailed than the general practitioners, and they were watching, across the counter, the human consequences of what was being prescribed. Some pharmacists intervened. They declined to fill prescriptions they thought were inappropriate, or they spoke to the patient at the point of refill about the duration of use, or they called the prescribing physician to discuss the pattern they were seeing. These interventions were individual, informal, and entirely dependent on the judgment and the courage of the specific pharmacist. There was no systematic mechanism that required, or even encouraged, the pharmacist to flag the pattern. The prescription was legal, the prescribing physician was licensed, and the pharmacist's role was to fill valid prescriptions, not to second-guess the physicians who wrote them. Other pharmacists filled the prescriptions without comment, because the prescriptions were valid, because the patients wanted the medication, because questioning the clinical judgment of a physician was professionally risky in an era when the hierarchy between physicians and other healthcare professionals was more rigid than it subsequently became. The filling of the prescription was not a moral failure in any simple sense. It was the correct performance of the pharmacist's legal role within the healthcare system as it was structured. The system was not designed to catch what the system was producing. The pharmacy was also, in the 1950s and 1960s, a community institution in ways that are harder to find in the current era of large chain pharmacies. The pharmacist in many communities knew the customers by name, knew their families, knew something about their lives. The over-the-counter products on the shelves, the weight loss aids, and the appetite suppressants, and the various non-prescription preparations that promised to help with the figure without requiring a visit to the physician, were visible to the pharmacist as another layer of the same demand. Women who were not getting prescriptions from physicians were trying other things, available without prescription, occupying the same counter where the prescription drugs were dispensed. The over-the-counter weight loss market of the post-war era was substantial and largely ungoverned. Products containing phenylpropanolamine, a compound with stimulant properties milder than amphetamine but with its own risk profile, were sold freely under various brand names. Products containing benzocaine, which numbed the mouth and was supposed to reduce the pleasure of eating and thereby reduce consumption, were sold freely. Thyroid extracts were sold in various preparations. Laxatives were sold in quantities that suggested use patterns beyond the management of constipation. The pharmacist who was filling the amphetamine prescriptions was standing at the intersection of the prescription market and the over-the-counter market, watching both, positioned to see the full scope of the demand and the various forms in which it was being met. What the pharmacist's counter reveals, held steadily in view, is the gap between the institutional and the human in the management of this particular era's pharmaceutical practice. The institutions, the FDA, the medical schools, the professional associations, the pharmaceutical companies, were operating according to their own logics, which were shaped by regulation and commerce, and professional norms and the scientific standards of the era. The human was showing up at the counter, filling the prescription, going home with the pills, and living out, in private, whatever the pills were producing. The gap between the institutional logic and the human experience was the space where the harm accumulated invisibly until it became large enough to be visible from outside. There is a detail that appears in several oral histories of women who took the rainbow pills in the prescription years, the pharmacist's expression, the slight hesitation at the counter, the look that was not quite approval and not quite disapproval, but was something more ambiguous, a look that acknowledged something the professional interaction could not officially acknowledge. Some women remembered this look as the only external sign they received during the years of prescriptions that the situation they were in was more complicated than the medical framework around it was allowing. The pharmacist knew, and the knowing was expressed in the one way available to it within the system, a look above the prescription bag that was there and then gone. The person behind the counter is not a dramatic figure in the history of the prescription years. The drama of the era, the congressional hearings, the regulatory battles, the pharmaceutical trials, the withdrawal, happened in other spaces, with other actors. The pharmacist filled the prescription, and yet the pharmacist's counter is where the pharmaceutical system's abstract operations became concrete, where the drug moved from the supply chain into the particular hand of the particular woman who was going to take it home and take it every morning. The counter is the threshold, and the threshold, if you stand at it long enough, in the right era, with the right attention, tells you everything about what a system was doing that the system's official account of itself will not say. What the body felt. There is a particular quality to the experience of amphetamine that is difficult to describe to someone who has not taken it, and equally difficult for someone who has to describe to someone who has not because it is ineffable in the poetic sense, but because the experience is so bound up with the context of having it, with the specific before state the drug is changing, with what felt absent before the drug arrived, that describing it in isolation loses something essential. What is possible to say is this: the world sharpens, the tasks clarify. The energy arrives without announcing itself and simply is, the way the body's energy is when it is well rested and the morning is cool and nothing is wrong. It feels like coming to the pace you are supposed to be moving at. It feels in the particular way that things feel when we first find them and before we have examined them, like something returning rather than something introduced. For many of the women who were prescribed Dexedrine or its relatives in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the initial experience was genuinely welcome. This is important to say clearly, because the history of this period is sometimes told in a way that implies the women were simply deceived, that the experience was unambiguously negative and the harm unambiguous from the start. This was not true. The energy was real. The appetite suppression was real. The weight, in many cases, came off. Not dramatically, not as quickly as the advertisements in women's magazines sometimes suggested, but consistently enough to provide the positive reinforcement that turned a prescription into a habit, and a habit into a dependency. And alongside the weight loss, there was the mood effect. The mood effect was, in many accounts, described as more significant than the appetite suppression, more life-changing, more disorienting in retrospect. Amphetamines increase the release of dopamine and norepinephrine in the brain, and the increase produces what pharmacologists call euphoria, and what the women who experienced it more often described as simply feeling better than usual, clearer than usual, more equal to the day than usual. The domestic tasks that had been managing themselves to a grind became tasks you could accomplish with something approaching satisfaction. The children's demands, which had been wearing, became manageable. The afternoon, which had been a thing to be got through, became a thing you moved through with something like agency. For women who were living in the particular constrictions of the 1950s domestic life, the constant labour of the household, the social expectations, the emotional management that fell entirely to them, the invisibility of all of it, the cultural insistence that it was easy and natural and what they had wanted, for these women, the slight elevation that the amphetamine provided was not a small thing. It was, in some testimonies, the first time they had felt fully present in their own lives in years. This is the particular complexity at the heart of this history. The drug was doing harm and providing genuine relief simultaneously, and the relief was real, and the harm was real, and they were not separable. The context of women's mental health in the 1950s is relevant here, and deserves some space. Women in that decade were also being prescribed tranquilizers in very large numbers. Miltown, meprobamate, a sedative that was the first modern tranquilizer, arrived in 1955 and became such a widespread prescription for women's anxiety and depression that it became a cultural touchstone. By 1957, over 36 million prescriptions had been written for it. The drug was referred to in magazine articles and newspaper columns with a casualness that indicates how thoroughly it had been normalized. It was what you took when the day was too much. It was what the doctor gave you when you came in with the feeling that everything was slightly too loud. The anxiety and depression that lived in women's bodies in that decade were real, and they were real in part because the lives those women were living were genuinely constraining. The constriction was not imagined. The exhaustion was not hysteria. The sense of foreclosure, of a future that had been narrowed by the decade's expectations to the dimensions of the household, was a reasonable response to a reasonable assessment of the situation. The prescription of mood-altering substances was not medicine acting in a vacuum. It was medicine responding to conditions that medicine had not created and could not resolve, but could, for a time and at a price, chemically address. Into this landscape of tranquilizers and domestic constraint, the amphetamine arrived with its particular gift. It did not sedate, it elevated, it did not suppress, it activated. For a woman who had been taking Miltown to manage her anxiety, the addition of Dexedrine to manage her weight produced for a time something like a pharmacological solution to the entire problem of being a woman in 1957. The anxiety quieted by one compound, the energy lifted by another, the appetite suppressed, the weight declining, the day more tractable, the mirror more satisfying. For a period that varied in length from woman to woman, but that was, for all of them, finite, the regime worked. The working had a particular quality, however, that distinguished it from ordinary well-being. It required maintenance. The energy and the mood and the appetite suppression did not accumulate in the body, to be drawn on when needed. They arrived with the pill and departed with the pill. Each day required the morning dose. Each morning dose produced the day's capacity. Each evening without the pill was the beginning of the reduction, the slow draining of what the pill had filled. This is the pharmacological definition of dependency, though the term was not widely applied to women taking diet pills in 1959. The experience was the same regardless of the term. The pill had become not a supplement to the self's resources, but a replacement for them. The physical side effects accumulated alongside the mood and appetite effects, becoming more pronounced as the months extended into years. Sleep disruption was nearly universal among women taking amphetamines for weight loss. The stimulant's action on the central nervous system made sleep initiation difficult, and the sleep that was achieved was often lighter and less restorative than the sleep before the prescription. Fatigue accumulated in the background of the days, disguised by the stimulant's surface energy, emerging in the evenings when the drug wore off as a heaviness that the culture did not have a sympathetic category for. The heart sometimes raced, not always, not consistently, not in every woman, but with sufficient frequency to constitute a pattern. Palpitations, the awareness of the heart beating at an unusual speed or rhythm, were reported by women in their accounts from this period with a frequency that suggests they were common rather than exceptional. The awareness was often frightening, and was often reported to physicians, and was often attributed by those physicians to the patient's anxiety rather than to the drug she was taking for the purposes of weight management. The attribution is significant. It placed the symptom inside the patient rather than inside the compound, which meant the compound's prescription continued while the symptom was addressed, if at all, with other medications. The dry mouth was constant. The jaw tension was common. The particular agitation that amphetamines produce, the revving quality, the sense of being slightly past the natural speed of the day, settled into some women as a new baseline that they barely noticed after enough months. What they did notice, and what appears consistently in the historical accounts, is the feeling of needing to be doing something, of difficulty sitting with the ordinary pace of the afternoon, of being held slightly above the resting state by something they had not consciously chosen to take on. And then there was the crash, the experience that most women who have spoken about this period describe with the greatest specificity and the most evident discomfort in the recollection. The crash was not dramatic in the way of acute opiate withdrawal, which produces violent physical symptoms that are impossible to ignore or misattribute. It was quieter and, in its own way, more insidious. It was the moment in the afternoon, or the evening, or the morning before the next dose, when the drug wore off and the state it had been maintaining simply left. When the clarity and the energy and the slight elevation of the amphetamine retreated, and what was left was the person who had been there before the first pill, but now flatter, more depleted, moving through the day's residue with a weight that felt not like ordinary tiredness, but like something specifically withdrawn. The crash was the body's communication that what had been provided by the drug was not available from within. It was the body revealing in its most direct language the difference between supplementation and replacement, between something that added to the self's resources and something that had taken over from them. The communication was clear. What lacked, in 1959, was the framework for receiving it accurately. The communication was received instead as the ordinary feeling of the late afternoon, or as tiredness, or as the reason to take the next pill. The cycle, pill, day, crash, pill, became the rhythm. The rhythm became invisible through repetition, the way all rhythms eventually become invisible. And within the invisible rhythm, the body was doing what bodies do when the management they are subjected to becomes the condition they are managed toward. It was adapting to the presence of the drug, requiring more of it for the same effect, becoming less capable of the effect without it. The adaptation was gradual, but it was thorough, and by the time it had gone on long enough to become undeniable, it had gone on long enough to be very difficult to reverse. 8 million women. That number deserves to sit in the room for a moment before the story continues. 8 million individual mornings with the orange bottle. 8 million individual experiences of the initial welcome and the adjustment and the maintenance and the crash. 8 million particular relationships between a body and a compound that the body had not chosen and the compound had not been designed for the body's long-term benefit. The number is too large for the imagination to hold whole, but it is not too large to hold seriously. It is not too large to treat as what it is: the accumulated weight of a systemic failure experienced in the privacy of 8 million separate lives. The language of medicine. Language shapes what can be seen, and what can be seen shapes what can be done. This is not a philosophical observation in the abstract. It is a practical observation about how medical systems work, how the terminology available in any given era determines what experiences can be identified, reported, filed, studied, and ultimately addressed. The prescription years produced a set of experiences in women that the language of medicine in the 1950s was not equipped to describe accurately. And what the language could not describe, the system could not address. The language was not inadequate because the people who used it were unintelligent. The language was inadequate because it had been built for other purposes, and the experiences the women were having had not yet been adequately anticipated. The word addiction carried, in the 1950s, a set of connotations that placed it firmly outside the world of the middle-class housewife and her prescription bottle. Addiction was a word for heroin, for morphine, for the opium dens of the newspaper melodramas and the desperate figures on the margins of society that the era's anti-drug narratives conjured. Addiction was dramatic, physical, visible. It appeared in the face and the body as deterioration, in the posture as desperation, in the social context as marginalization. The word was too large and too charged for the experience of a woman who took her Dexedrine every morning with her coffee, and who was, to all appearances, managing her domestic life efficiently and maintaining her figure appropriately. What was available instead were euphemisms. The pills were medicine. They were the prescription from Dr. So-and-so. They were what the doctor had recommended, and what the doctor recommended was by definition medical rather than something else. The experience of needing them, the specific experience of the day being heavier without them, the morning being more difficult without them, the appetite returning with a force that felt threatening without them, was not a symptom with a clean medical name. It was simply how things were. How things were had no vocabulary that implicated the prescription, because the prescription was medicine, and medicine did not create these problems. The language of iatrogenic harm caused by medical treatment, was available in the medical literature, but it was a technical term that had not entered the vocabulary of the examining room or the living room. The specific term prescription drug dependency was similarly specialist, similarly confined to corners of the pharmacology and psychiatry literature, where it was discussed with appropriate technical care and no particular urgency, because the populations being discussed, the people in whom the dependency was documented, were understood to be exceptional cases rather than the predictable consequence of a widely distributed prescribing practice. The language problem extended to the experience of withdrawal. When women who had been taking amphetamines stopped taking them and experienced the depression and fatigue and appetite return that the withdrawal produced, the experience did not have a medical name that connected it to the prescription. Depression was depression, fatigue was fatigue. The appetite returning after months of suppression was understood as the return of the problem the prescription had been managing, evidence in some clinical framings that the prescription was still needed rather than evidence that the prescription had produced a dependency that its cessation was now revealing. The language loop was closed. The dependency perpetuated itself through the inadequacy of the language for recognizing it. Betty Friedan's contribution to the language of women's experience in the post-war era is worth examining in this context. Her phrase, the problem that has no name for the dissatisfaction that lived in so many women's domestic lives, was a linguistic intervention before it was anything else. By naming the namelessness, by pointing to the absence of a name for something that was real and widely experienced, she created the possibility of a different kind of attention. She made the experience visible as an experience, rather than invisible as a collection of individual symptoms with no connection to each other. The naming was not adequate to the problem. The problem required more than naming, required structural changes that naming alone could not produce. But the naming was necessary. You cannot address what you cannot describe. The women's health movement of the late 1960s and 1970s was engaged in significant part in a project of language development, creating terms and concepts and frameworks for experiences that medicine had either not named at all or had named in ways that served medicine rather than the women it was supposed to serve. the term medical paternalism began to circulate, the pattern in which physicians made decisions for women rather than with them, in which women's own assessments of their experiences were subordinated to the physician's interpretation of those experiences. The term informed consent began to acquire a different weight. The understanding that genuinely informed consent required more information than the medical system was typically providing to women about the drugs they were being offered. The diagnostic category of addiction was being expanded and refined in the 1970s in ways that were beginning to make room for the experience of prescription drug dependency. The concept of physical dependence, the body's physiological adaptation to the presence of a substance, producing withdrawal effects when the substance is removed, was being distinguished from the concept of psychological addiction, and both were being distinguished from the social and criminal dimensions of drug use that had previously dominated the addiction concept. The distinction mattered for prescription drug dependency because the dependency that women had developed on amphetamines was primarily physiological and psychological. It was not associated with the criminal behavior and social deterioration that the older addiction concept had emphasized. Giving it an accurate name was the precondition for treating it and for recognizing the scale on which it had been produced. The word obesity is another case study in how the language of medicine shapes experience. The medicalization of weight, the decision to define weight above certain thresholds as a disease or disease risk, requiring medical management, is a language decision with enormous practical consequences. It determines who is a patient, what treatments are appropriate, what insurance will cover, what physicians are obligated to address. The category of obesity as a medical condition has a long history and has expanded significantly over time, with threshold definitions that have changed in ways that reflect scientific understanding, but also commercial and cultural pressures. The current definition, based on BMI thresholds that have their own history and their own limitations, is a language that has clinical validity in some contexts and cultural load in others, and the two are not always distinguishable in the conversation between a patient and a physician. When a physician and a patient discuss the patient's weight in the language of medicine, in the language of clinical risk factors, of metabolic health markers, of treatment options and prescription eligibility, they are conducting a conversation that is shaped by all of the history that produced that language. The clinical language for weight is not neutral. It carries the weight of the decades that built it. The decades in which weight was medicalized, in which pharmaceutical solutions were developed and promoted, in which the clinical designation of excess weight as a medical problem, rather than a cultural pressure, was established as the dominant framework. The language is functional. It is also, in ways that are not always visible from inside it, shaped by interests that are not purely clinical. Learning to see the language, to notice its assumptions, to understand its history, to recognize what it makes visible and what it leaves in the dark, is one of the more practical skills that the history of the prescription years makes available, not as an exercise in suspicion, not as a reason to reject all medical framing, but as a form of literacy, the ability to read what the language is doing, as well as what it is saying. The ability to ask in any clinical conversation, what framework is this sitting in? What history produced this frame? And what might look different if the frame were different? The language of the current moment is more sophisticated than the language of 1955 in several important ways. There is more vocabulary for dependency, for iatrogenic harm, for the relationship between cultural pressure and medical demand, for the limits of pharmacological solutions to non-pharmacological problems. The vocabulary is not comprehensive. There are still experiences that the current medical language does not name well, still women who are describing things that the clinical categories do not have adequate room for. The work of developing the language continues. It is patient work, unglamorous work, the kind of work that tends not to produce dramatic moments, but it is the precondition for everything else that follows from seeing things accurately. The women in the prescription years were living in the gap between their experience and the language that would eventually describe it. They felt what they felt and knew what they knew, in the full and specific way that people know things they are living through, and they reached for words and found the words inadequate and kept reaching. The reaching was not always visible. It happened inside, in the private inventory of experience that each person maintains, in the moments when the right word seems like it should exist and does not. The words came later. The women were there first, holding the experience in the wordless space before the naming, waiting for the language to catch up with what the body already knew. The housewife, hi. There is a sentence that appears, in various forms, across the accounts that women who were prescribed amphetamines in the 1950s and 1960s gave to researchers and journalists in the decades that followed. The sentence takes different shapes in different mouths, but always carries the same essential content. Something like, "I got so much done." Something like, "The house was always clean. The children were managed. I had dinner ready. I was a better mother when I was on them. And then I stopped and I could not understand how I had ever managed any of it without them." This sentence is doing several things at once. It is describing a genuine pharmacological effect. Amphetamines increase output, reduce fatigue, allow tasks to be completed at a pace and thoroughness that is beyond the natural capacity of most human beings for most of the waking day. It is also describing the trap, a domestic standard that was achievable only with the chemical assistance of the drug, and that became, over the months and years of use, the measure by which the woman without the drug measured her own insufficiency. The pill established the baseline. The baseline required the pill to maintain. The requirement became invisible because it was simply how things were. The domestic role of women in 1950s America was not, in the cultural presentation of the era, understood as labour. It was understood as vocation. Women's magazines described the management of the household in terms that were closer to art than to work. The careful meal planning, the social coordination, the maintenance of the home as a space of order and beauty and welcome, all of it framed as an expression of the feminine self, rather than as an economic contribution or a form of employment. The domestic role was the purpose, and performing it well was the fulfillment of that purpose, and the idea that the performance might be exhausting, might require more than the ordinary human body could readily supply, was not a framework that the culture offered. It was, however, a framework that the prescription offered. Amphetamines gave women what the culture required them to have: the energy to perform tasks that were relentless, the mood to be present and pleasant through hours of repetitive work, the focus to manage the logistics of a household without the distraction of their own fatigue or disappointment or desire for something different. The drug's action on the nervous system produced precisely the qualities that the decade's domestic ideal specified: efficiency, consistency, cheerfulness, inexhaustibility. It was, in a pharmacological sense, designed for the job, or rather, the job turned out to be precisely suited to what the drug provided. The pharmaceutical marketing of this period grasped this connection, sometimes with remarkable directness. Advertisements for amphetamine-based compounds that appeared in the advertising pages of American medical journals in the late 1950s and early 1960s featured domestic imagery with a consistency that reveals both the company's understanding of their market and their confidence that the market was acceptable. A woman at a kitchen sink, a woman with children in a yard, a woman organising something, managing something, performing the labour of the household with an efficiency and apparent contentment that the advertisement's copy promised could be pharmacologically assisted. The implicit address of these advertisements was to the physician, but the implicit message was about the patient. This drug will help your patient perform her function more effectively. The function was domestic, the medication was pharmaceutical, the connection was presented as natural, and in the cultural context of the era it was natural. Natural in the specific sense of something so thoroughly embedded in the shared assumptions of the time that questioning it required stepping outside those assumptions entirely, which was not something the era made easy. The physician who looked at a domestic advertisement for an appetite suppressant and thought there is something wrong with this had to locate, first, what was wrong with it, had to identify which of the assumptions embedded in the image was the one that should not be assumed. This is difficult to do from inside an assumption. It tends to require either unusual critical distance or the kind of outside perspective that comes from being outside the cultural centre rather than inside it. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963, was the cultural document that most successfully named what the advertisements were assuming: the assumption that women's domestic function was their natural destiny, and that the distress they felt within it was a problem in themselves rather than a problem in the arrangement. Friedan called the distress the problem that has no name, a pervasive dissatisfaction among educated American women, a depression and restlessness that lived beneath the surfaces of the comfortable households they inhabited, and that had no culturally acceptable vocabulary. The book was imperfect. It spoke primarily to white middle-class women excluding large populations of women whose relationship to the domestic ideal was shaped by entirely different economic and racial realities. But the thing it named was real, and it had been real for the decade that preceded it. The amphetamine prescription was, in significant part, a medical response to the problem that had no name. A woman who came to her physician with vague dissatisfaction, with low energy, with the feeling that the days were harder than they should be, with the sense that she could not quite manage. This woman was presenting with symptoms that medicine, in the early 1960s, was not equipped to diagnose as structural. It could not prescribe a more equitable distribution of domestic labour. It could not prescribe liberation from the domestic role, or acknowledgement that the role was exhausting, or cultural permission to have different aspirations. What it could prescribe was something that would make the role more manageable within its existing terms, and it did. Women on amphetamines reported, in consistent numbers, an improvement in their capacity to perform the domestic tasks that the era required. The cleaning was done more thoroughly, the meals were prepared more efficiently, the children's activities were managed more effectively. The social obligations, the neighbourhood functions, the school board meetings, the maintenance of the friendships and family connections that women were expected to sustain, were discharged with something closer to equanimity. The pill was working. This was the evidence. The fact that the pill's work was producing a dependency that would take years to fully emerge was not yet part of the evidence that the physicians or the patients or the cultural conversation could see. There is a specific dimension of this history that requires some care to articulate without distortion. The experience of the housewife high was not experienced by the women who were inside it as addiction. The word addiction was attached, in the cultural imagination of the early 1960s, to a specific population: the narcotic user, the morphine addict, the person in the grip of a dependency that was visible as such because its markers, the physical deterioration, the social marginalization, the desperation, were dramatically evident. The woman on Dexedrine who was cleaning her house more efficiently and managing her children more effectively and presenting to the world a competent, capable domestic self did not match the template of the addict. She matched the template of the well-managed woman, and so her dependency was invisible inside the very performance it was enabling. Some women became aware eventually of the extent of what had happened, who noticed the dependency forming and were frightened by the noticing, who tried to reduce their doses or stop taking the pills and found the reduction or the stopping more difficult than anything in their previous experience, who went back to their doctors and described the difficulty. Some of those doctors recognized what they were seeing. Many did not. The category of prescription drug dependency, of iatrogenic addiction, was not yet a well-developed clinical framework in the early 1960s. The tools for identifying it, the protocols for addressing it, the language for discussing it with patients, all of these were in early development in the research literature, but had not yet become part of standard clinical practice. And so, the dependency continued in many cases to be managed with more prescriptions. A woman who was having difficulty stopping her amphetamines because the stopping produced depression was sometimes given an antidepressant for the depression, while the amphetamine prescription continued. A woman who was having difficulty with the anxiety that amphetamines produced was sometimes given a tranquilizer for the anxiety, while the amphetamine continued. The pharmaceutical response to the pharmaceutical problem was another pharmaceutical, and the layering continued until the woman was managing a medication complex that had grown far beyond the original prescription for weight loss, and that had produced dependencies far beyond the original dependency that she might or might not have had the language to name. The housewife high is not a phrase from the era. It is a retrospective description, developed by researchers and historians who are looking back at the prescription years with the benefit of later understanding. But the thing it describes was experienced in real time, in real bodies, in real kitchens with real coffee pots and real children and real mirrors. The experience was ordinary and domestic and private, and not spoken about in the ways that would have allowed it to accumulate into a visible public phenomenon. It lived in the medicine cabinets and the daily schedules and the unspoken internal assessments that women made of their own capacity to cope with the days they had been assigned. The days eventually changed. The decade moved on. The cultural pressure did not disappear, but it shifted its form, and the women who had been living inside the prescription years, some of them for a few months, some for a decade, had to navigate the shift while still carrying what the prescription years had left in their bodies. The navigation was often difficult, and often private, and often undertaken without adequate support from the system that had created the need for it. The Housewife high ended eventually one way or another for all of them. The landing was rarely as smooth as the flight. The economics of staying small. The prescription did not happen in an economic vacuum. Nothing in healthcare does. Behind the examining room and the prescription pad and the small orange bottle and the individual experience of the individual woman, there was an economic structure that had an enormous stake in the outcome, in the continuation of the prescribing practice, in the multiplication of the prescriptions, in the development of new products and new clinical indications and new patients who could be enrolled in the pharmaceutical management of their weight. Understanding the economics does not reduce the story to a conspiracy. It adds a dimension to the story that is necessary for understanding why the pattern was so durable and why the response to evidence of harm was so slow. Smith, Kline & French, the pharmaceutical company that developed and initially marketed Benzedrine, was not a small operation. By the time the amphetamine prescription years were at their height, Smith, Kline & French was one of the larger pharmaceutical companies in the United States, with a substantial investment in the stimulant market and a significant commercial interest in maintaining the conditions under which that market could operate. They were not the only player. Abbott Laboratories, which manufactured Desoxin, and the companies that manufactured the various branded versions of dextroamphetamine and other stimulant compounds, were also substantial commercial entities with their own stakes in the prescribing practice. The pharmaceutical sales apparatus that these companies deployed in the 1950s was, by the standards of its time, sophisticated. The detail men who visited physician offices were trained communicators with specific messaging for specific drugs. The journal advertising was designed with care, placing the products in frameworks that aligned with physicians' professional self-understanding as helpers, as problem solvers, as scientists who had access to the tools that patients needed. The examples distributed to physicians allowed the prescribing practice to be established before a patient had paid for anything, reducing the friction between the physician's inclination to prescribe and the prescription actually being written. The economics of the diet pill business were favourable in ways that are instructive. The drugs were not expensive to manufacture relative to their selling price. The market, women who were experiencing distress about their weight and who were seeking medical assistance, that was very large and crucially renewable. The drugs did not cure the underlying condition. They managed it for as long as they were taken. A patient who took the drug for a year and then needed to continue was a patient who was generating revenue for a year and would continue generating revenue if she continued taking the drug, or if the drug required refilling. The business model was, in the terminology that would be used later in pharmaceutical analysis, a maintenance model rather than a cure model. The distinction has important commercial implications. A drug that cures generates revenue until the disease is cured. A drug that manages generates revenue indefinitely. The dependency that amphetamines produced was, from a strictly commercial standpoint, a feature that could be reframed as evidence of effectiveness. A patient who found it difficult to stop taking the drug was a patient who was continuing to take it. Continued use was continued revenue. The commercial interest in describing the dependency as clinically appropriate, as evidence that the drug was working as the natural consequence of a medical condition requiring ongoing management, was aligned with the commercial interest in continued prescription, in continued production, in continued growth of a market that was showing no signs of saturation. This alignment of interests is not the same as a plan. The pharmaceutical executives who made decisions about how to market amphetamines for weight loss were not in the majority of cases sitting in rooms and planning how to maintain a dependency-producing market. They were doing what people in commercial enterprises do, pursuing the interests of their organizations within the constraints of the regulatory and cultural environment they were operating in. The regulatory environment, as described elsewhere in this history, was not adequately designed to constrain those interests in the specific ways that the situation required. The cultural environment was actively generating the demand that the commercial interest was serving. The alignment of commercial interest with cultural demand and inadequate regulatory constraint produced the conditions for the harm that occurred. No single actor planned it. The system produced it. The economic incentives at the level of the prescribing physician were more ambiguous, but also present. Physicians in private practice in the 1950s were running small businesses as well as practicing medicine. The patients who came for weight loss prescriptions were returning patients, generating appointment revenue, generating refill prescription revenue if they needed to come in for refills, generating the specific kind of practice growth that satisfied patients who told their friends produced. A physician whose patients lost weight and came back satisfied and recommended the practice to neighbours was a physician with a growing practice. The incentives were not monetary in any crude or deliberate sense. They were structural. The practice rewarded outcomes that patients valued, and patients valued weight loss, and the pills produced weight loss, and therefore the pills were good for the practice in the way that effective treatments are generally good for practices. The economics of the current era's weight loss pharmaceutical market are substantially larger. The GLP-1 agonists are among the most expensive drugs in the history of widespread prescription, prices that run to hundreds or thousands of dollars per month before insurance coverage, prices that reflect the massive development and clinical trial costs of these sophisticated biologics, as well as the commercial value the manufacturers have established in a market with very high demand. The market value added to pharmaceutical companies by the approval and commercial success of semaglutide and its successors is among the largest in pharmaceutical history. These are facts that do not determine whether the drugs are harmful or beneficial, but they are facts that are relevant to understanding the incentive structure within which the clinical and regulatory decisions about these drugs are being made. The insurance landscape around GLP-1 agonists has become a significant site of the tension between clinical and commercial interests. Some insurance plans cover the drugs for diabetes and for obesity with significant comorbidities. Fewer cover them for weight loss in the absence of those conditions. The coverage decisions are made by entities that are themselves commercially structured, that have their own incentives around coverage versus non-coverage, and that are making those decisions in a context where the clinical evidence for long-term benefit and long-term risk is still developing. The gap between what insurance covers and what is being prescribed, the prescriptions that are written and filled and paid for out of pocket by patients with access to financial resources, is a gap that tracks, in its own way, the inequity in the distribution of both the benefits and the risks of the pharmaceutical approach to weight. The out-of-pocket market for GLP-1 agonists is substantial and is being supplied in ways that have caused regulatory concern. Compounding pharmacies that are permitted to manufacture customized formulations of drugs for patients with specific needs, have been producing semaglutide in large quantities and selling it at significantly lower prices than the branded products. The FDA has taken regulatory action to address the compounding of these drugs without adequate oversight, but the market has been sufficiently large and the demand sufficiently strong that the regulation has been an ongoing challenge rather than a swift resolution. The compounding market is a symptom of the same dynamic that has operated throughout the history of weight loss pharmacology. The cultural demand is large enough and powerful enough to find supply channels that regulatory frameworks have not yet adequately governed. The women who are navigating the current pharmaceutical landscape, deciding whether to seek a prescription, whether to pay out of pocket for a compounded version, whether the benefit justifies the cost and the uncertainty, whether the pressure they are feeling to be smaller is medical or cultural or both, and what the distinction means for their decision, are making decisions in an economic context that shapes the choices available to them at least as much as the clinical evidence does. The woman who can afford the branded drug and whose insurance covers it has a different decision than the woman who cannot afford it but can access the compounded version and the woman who cannot access either. The economic structure is producing a specific distribution of access to a specific treatment, and that distribution has its own consequences for who benefits and who is exposed to risks without adequate clinical oversight. What the economics of staying small have always produced, in the rainbow pill era, in the Fen-Phen era, in the current moment, is a market whose size is determined not by clinical need, but by cultural demand. Clinical need is real, and the people who meet it constitute a significant and deserving patient population. But the market extends substantially beyond clinical need into the territory of cultural pressure, and in that territory the economic incentives that drive the market are not aligned with the interests of the people the market is serving. They are aligned with the continuation of the market. The market is self-sustaining in the specific way that markets are self-sustaining when they are serving a need that their products cannot resolve. They can address the symptom indefinitely while the cause remains intact, because the cause is outside the market's reach, and this is the market's greatest commercial advantage. The woman at the mirror in the early morning is, among other things, a market. This is not the most important thing she is, but it is a dimension of her situation that has been actively constructed over a century of commerce, and understanding it as such is one of the ways of recovering a slightly different relationship to the mirror's instruction. Not immunity, the instruction is too pervasive for immunity to be a realistic goal for most people, but perhaps a slightly more clear-eyed recognition of where the instruction comes from and who benefits from the following of it, and what might be different if the instruction were understood as the product of a system rather than as the simple truth about what a body should be. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The science they didn't publish. The scientific literature on amphetamine dependency existed before the mass prescription of these drugs to American women. This is one of the more uncomfortable facts of this period, and one of the more important ones for understanding how the harm accumulated over so many years. The knowledge was there, in some form, in some part of the system, before the worst of the damage was done. What it lacked, what the knowledge always lacks in pharmaceutical history, when it arrives before the harm is politically and commercially convenient to acknowledge, was the connection between the research and the examining room. The pipeline from what researchers were observing to what physicians were prescribing was broken, in ways that were structural rather than accidental. Amphetamine's capacity to produce psychological dependency was described in the medical literature as early as the late 1930s. A paper published in 1938 described users of benzedrine inhalers who were consuming the drug not for its decongestant purpose, but for its mood effects, who were returning to the inhaler compulsively, who were experiencing difficulty stopping. The paper appeared in a journal that physicians read. The observation was noted, cited in subsequent literature, and filed under the category of misuse, a category that applied to people who were taking the drug for recreational purposes, not to the category of patients who were taking it on a physician's prescription for weight management. The misuse category and the medical use category remained separate in the clinical imagination, and this separation allowed physicians to prescribe without incorporating the misuse research into their risk assessment. The separation was pharmacologically untenable. The molecule did not behave differently in the body of a person who was taking it on prescription from the way it behaved in the body of a person who had obtained it by other means. Dependency does not require illegality as a precondition. The nervous system does not check the label on the bottle before responding to the compound. But the categories in which the risks of the drug were discussed, the language of misuse, of abuse, of addiction, all carried social markers that placed them outside the respectable patient. The respectable patient was not in those categories, and so the research in those categories was not understood to apply to the respectable patient. The reasoning was circular, the circularity was invisible from inside it. The Food and Drug Administration that existed in the 1950s was substantially different from the institution it would become after 1962. The 1962 Kefauver-Harris amendments to the Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act, amendments driven primarily by the thalidomide crisis, which caused an estimated 10,000 birth defects in Europe and was narrowly averted in the United States through the refusal of a single FDA reviewer, Francis Kelsey, to approve the drug despite significant pressure, required for the first time that pharmaceutical manufacturers demonstrate not just that their drugs were safe, but that they were effective. Before 1962, effectiveness was not a regulatory requirement. A drug could be approved for sale in the United States if the manufacturer could demonstrate that it was not demonstrably dangerous. The bar for demonstrating non-danger was considerably lower than a later era would have accepted. Amphetamines had been approved before the 1962 amendments under the older standard. They were grandfathered into the regulatory landscape with a level of evidentiary support that subsequent standards would not have accepted as adequate. This was not unique to amphetamines. A large number of drugs that were in wide prescription use by 1962 would eventually be found to lack adequate evidence of efficacy under the stricter standard, and some would subsequently be withdrawn. But for amphetamines, the grandfathering meant that the drugs that were being prescribed in massive quantities to millions of women in the late 1950s had not been rigorously evaluated for their long-term safety in that specific population, and that the regulatory system was not equipped to demand such evaluation after the fact. Post-market surveillance, the systematic monitoring of drug effects in the real-world population after approval, as opposed to in the controlled conditions of pre-approval clinical trials, was also substantially less developed in the 1950s than it would become in subsequent decades. The adverse event reporting system that exists today, through which physicians and patients can report suspected drug side effects to the FDA, was not established in its current form until after the 1962 amendments. Before those amendments, the collection of post-market safety data was voluntary, unsystematic, and filtered through the clinical culture that was already invested in the drugs being prescribed. The research that was being conducted in this period on amphetamines' effects was not all favourable to the prescribing practice. There were researchers who were observing dependency, who were documenting the effects of long-term use, who were publishing findings that were inconsistent with the pharmaceutical industry's framing of the drugs as safe and effective for weight management. But this research faced the specific challenges that research faces when its findings are commercially inconvenient. Studies that showed risks were harder to fund and harder to publish than studies that showed benefits. The pharmaceutical companies did not fund research into their products' risks. Independent funding for such research was limited. The researchers who persisted were doing so against the current rather than with it. Publication bias, the tendency of scientific journals to publish positive findings more readily than null or negative findings, operated in this period as it operates in all periods, though the phenomenon was not yet formally named and studied. Researchers who conducted studies showing that amphetamines were effective for short-term weight loss had a relatively straightforward path to publication. Researchers who conducted studies showing that the drugs produced dependency, that the weight loss was not sustained, that the long-term effects were concerning. These researchers faced more resistance, needed stronger evidence to overcome editorial skepticism, and sometimes found their work delayed or published in lower visibility venues. The accumulating picture in the peer-reviewed literature was therefore skewed toward the positive, not because negative findings did not exist, but because the system's incentives filtered them out before they could reach the physicians who were making prescribing decisions. The detail men, the pharmaceutical sales representatives who visited physicians' offices, who left samples and literature and the specific talking points their companies had developed, were a significant part of the information environment in which prescribing decisions were made. A detail man was not a researcher. He was a trained communicator. His job was not to lie to physicians. Outright deception would have been counterproductive in a profession that valued accuracy in clinical information. His job was to present accurate information in the most favourable possible frame, to emphasize the benefits the company's research had established, and to contextualize the risks the company's research had also established in ways that minimized their clinical significance. He was good at his job. He was paid to be good at it. The environment created by all of these factors, the regulatory framework that did not require long-term safety data, the research culture that systematically filtered out negative findings, the marketing apparatus that shaped how clinical information reached prescribing physicians, was not a conspiracy. It was not designed by anyone to produce harm. It was the consequence of a set of systems that each operated according to its own logic, and together produced an outcome that none of them individually intended. The pharmaceutical companies wanted to sell drugs. The regulatory system wanted to prevent demonstrable immediate harm. The researchers wanted to answer their specific research questions. The physicians wanted to treat their patients. Each of these actors was pursuing a reasonable goal by reasonable means. The combination produced a system that was inadequate to protect the people who were depending on it. By 1962, the year the regulatory amendments were passed, approximately 3.5 billion amphetamine tablets were being produced annually in the United States. This figure is remarkable in any context and requires a moment to register. 3.5 billion tablets. Not all of these were for weight loss. Amphetamines were also prescribed for narcolepsy, for depression, for attention difficulties in children, for fatigue in various clinical contexts. But the weight loss market was, by the early 1960s, the largest single driver of the production increase. The production figures tell a story that the clinical literature, filtered as it was through the biases described above, was not telling as clearly. The drug was being produced and consumed at a scale that had no precedent in the history of psychoactive substances. Women who were reporting to their physicians in the early 1960s that something felt wrong, that the pills had become something they could not do without, that the stopping was more difficult than the starting, that their hearts raced or their moods crashed or their days felt hollow without the morning dose, were reporting into a clinical environment that did not yet have an adequate category for what they were describing. The physician who heard these reports and responded with reassurance or adjustment or additional prescriptions was not being dishonest. He was working within the framework he had been given. The framework was inadequate. The inadequacy was structural, and the women who were suffering the consequences of the inadequacy were the last people in the system with the power to change it. The science that would eventually accumulate to change the clinical consensus was already being done, in some corners, by the early 1960s. It would take years to develop the critical mass needed to force the regulatory and clinical response that the evidence warranted. The timeline is documented. The gap between the first warnings and the regulatory response is measurable. And sitting with that gap, really sitting with it, holding the 30 years between the first documented dependency concerns of the late 1930s and the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, is one of the more sobering exercises that the history of this period invites. 30 years is a very long time to carry unpublished knowledge in your body while the formal literature catches up. For the women who were living through those years, the weight was not abstract. It was the specific daily experience of taking a pill that was making them unwell in ways that medicine was not yet ready to name. The naming would come. It always comes, eventually. The question is always how long the eventual takes, and how many bodies it passes through on the way to becoming official. The body is a patient record. It keeps everything. It keeps what was given to it, and what was taken from it, and what was done to it in the name of help. The body does not distinguish between official and unofficial harm. It does not wait for the peer-reviewed literature to confirm what it is experiencing. It registers, it records, it carries. And eventually, when the culture catches up to what the body has been carrying, the record becomes speakable. The speak is slow, but the body's record is complete. The crash. The reckoning, when it arrived with a particular quality that reckonings have when they have been delayed long enough. Too much at once, in too many directions simultaneously, still somehow not enough. The regulatory response, the clinical response, the cultural response, all of them came eventually, and all of them came later than the evidence had warranted, and between the evidence and the response in the gap that all institutional processes produce between knowing and acting, there were the women, living in that gap, managing the days the gap produced, waiting without knowing they were waiting for a language that was on its way. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 is the regulatory landmark. It classified amphetamines as Schedule II substances, high potential for abuse, limited recognised medical use, requiring specific prescriptions that could not be called in by phone, could not be refilled without a new prescription, and were subject to a federal oversight regime that the previous regulatory landscape had not provided. The classification did not end amphetamine prescription for legitimate medical purposes. It continues to this day for conditions including attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and narcolepsy, with robust clinical evidence supporting those uses. What it ended effectively was the large volume casual prescription for weight loss in otherwise healthy women that had characterized the previous 2 decades. The ending was not instantaneous, and it was not clean. Controlled Substances Act or no Controlled Substances Act, the women who had been taking the drugs were still taking the drugs on the day the act was signed, and they still faced the challenge of stopping, a challenge that their physicians, many of whom had been prescribing the drugs without particular attention to the dependency question, were not always equipped to help them navigate. The reclassification created a legal framework for tighter control, but it did not create a clinical framework for the management of the dependency that the previous framework had produced. Women who attempted to stop taking amphetamines after long-term use encountered the full expression of the dependency that the years of prescription had created. The experience is described in consistent terms across different accounts, from different women in different places. A heaviness that settled in the days without the drug, a flatness of mood that was more than ordinary sadness, a fatigue that was deeper than ordinary tiredness, and that did not respond to the ordinary remedies of rest and sleep and time. The brain that had been running on artificially elevated dopamine and norepinephrine levels for months or years was now running on its natural levels, which felt, in the specific way that things feel when they have been replaced for long enough, like insufficiency. Depression was common in the withdrawal period, and its commonality is pharmacologically predictable. The extended elevation of dopamine and norepinephrine that amphetamine produces downregulates the receptors that respond to those neurotransmitters, meaning that after the drug is removed, the brain's own production of those chemicals is insufficient to produce normal mood in the altered receptor landscape. The brain, in other words, has adapted to the drug's presence in ways that require the drug's continued presence to feel normal. The adaptation is the dependency. The depression of withdrawal is the dependency making itself known by its absence. Physicians who encountered women in the withdrawal period did not always recognize what they were seeing. The clinical presentation, a woman who was depressed, fatigued, having difficulty managing her daily responsibilities, was entirely consistent with the presentations that had been bringing women to physicians for the previous decade. The physician who had not been thinking carefully about dependency might see the same presenting problem that had originally warranted the prescription, and in some cases that physician wrote another prescription. Not necessarily the same drug, perhaps an antidepressant or a different stimulant, or a combination. The pharmaceutical response to the pharmaceutical problem continued. The appetite returned. For many women who had been taking amphetamines for weight management, this was the most immediately distressing consequence of stopping. The drug's appetite suppression ended, and the hunger that had been pharmacologically suppressed returned with a force that felt compensatory, as though the body were reclaiming what had been withheld from it over months of reduced eating. The weight that had been lost came back, often at a rate that was faster than the rate at which it had been lost, for physiological reasons that were not yet fully understood in 1971 but are better understood now. The return of the weight felt like failure. The framework available for understanding it, the framework in which weight was a controllable variable, and the inability to control it was a personal inadequacy, provided no other interpretation. There were women who navigated the withdrawal and the weight return with the support of physicians who understood what was happening and could help them manage it. These women were fortunate in the specific sense of having access to medical care that was adequate to their situation. There were also women, probably the majority, who navigated it largely alone, within families and communities that did not know what was happening or did not have the language to address it, managing a private experience of physical and psychological difficulty that the culture of the early 1970s was not yet equipped to acknowledge as what it was. The women's health movement was doing some of this acknowledgement on parallel tracks. The publication of Our Bodies Ourselves in 1970, first as a newsprint pamphlet produced by the Boston Women's Health Book Collective, later as the book that would be translated into 29 languages and would sell 4 million copies in the United States alone, was a landmark in the history of women's relationship to their own medical care. The pamphlet's premise was radical for its time and remained significant, that women were capable of understanding their own bodies and their own medical care, that the medical system had not always served them well, and that the sharing of knowledge between women was a form of power that the medical establishment had not sufficiently recognized. The book did not initially address the amphetamine prescription in specific terms. The 1970 pamphlet was focused primarily on reproductive health, sexuality, and the experience of pregnancy and birth. But the framework it established, the framework of women as knowers of their own bodies, as legitimate sources of medical information about their own experiences, as people whose reports of adverse effects were evidence rather than complaint, was directly applicable to the experience of the prescription years. Women who had read Our Bodies, Ourselves, and absorbed its framework were women who had a different relationship to their own medical history than women who had not. They had, at least in principle, permission to say, "Something happened to me that was done by medicine, and medicine is not exempt from examination." Congressional hearings in the early 1970s provided a public forum for examining what had happened. Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin, who held hearings on the pharmaceutical industry's marketing practices and the prescription of mood-altering substances to women, was one of the more persistent legislative voices asking what, exactly, was being given to American women and on what evidence. The hearings heard testimony from researchers who had been documenting dependency, from women who had experienced it, and from pharmaceutical industry representatives who maintained, with varying degrees of conviction, that the drugs had been prescribed appropriately and that the developing evidence of harm was being addressed adequately by the industry's own practices. The hearings produced no single dramatic outcome. They contributed to a shifting conversation and a shifting regulatory climate. The crash did not end on a single day. It extended across years for many women. The years of withdrawal, the years of weight return, the years of depression and fatigue, and the slow, imperfect, unsupported process of returning to a neurological baseline that had been altered by years of pharmaceutical intervention. For some women, that process was completed in a year or two. For others, it was longer. For some, the women who had been taking the drugs for the longest periods, at the highest doses, with the least clinical support on the way in and on the way out, the neurological effects were durable in ways that the clinical understanding of the time could not fully characterize. The crash also revealed, for women who were in a position to see it clearly, something about what the prescription years had been. The specific texture of the revelation, the experience of having believed yourself to be managing, to be coping, to be maintaining the domestic and personal standards that the era required, and then discovering in the aftermath that the management had been pharmacologically assisted in ways you had not fully acknowledged, was not simple. It was not a revelation that produced clear moral emotions. It produced something more complicated, a kind of retroactive questioning of the previous years, an uncertainty about which of the achievements of those years were hers and which were the drugs, a disorientation in the relationship between the self and the record of the self. The disorientation is one of the less discussed consequences of the prescription years, and it deserves a moment. When a drug has been part of your daily functioning for years, and the drug is removed, you face the question of what you are like without it. This question has a straightforward answer in principle. You are like what you are now, or something close to it. But it does not have a straightforward experiential answer, because the self without the drug is not the same self that existed before the drug, and the comparison is therefore not between an after-drug self and a before-drug self, but between an after-drug self and an experience of the before-drug self that has been distorted by the drug's presence in the interval. The comparison is in this sense permanently unavailable. What was lost cannot be fully recovered, even when the drug is gone, because what was lost included the unmedicated experience of the years in between. The crash was the beginning of the understanding, not the full understanding, not yet, but the beginning. The beginning of women naming what had happened to them, to each other, and then to researchers, and then to journalists, and then to the public record, in the specific careful language of people who are describing an experience that has not yet been named by anyone else, and that they are not entirely sure will be believed. The naming was difficult. The being believed was more difficult still. But it happened, slowly, and the crash that had been private for so many years began to become a shared experience, which is the precondition for a shared understanding. Women who did not take the pill. The 8 million is a number for those who did. But there is another number, harder to count, harder to name, invisible in the official statistics, for those who did not. The women who were offered the prescription and declined it. The women who filled it once and did not refill it. The women who decided, for reasons that the culture of the time did not provide an easy framework for articulating, that the small orange bottle was not the answer they were looking for. These women exist. They are part of the story. Their absence from the count is itself a form of evidence. The reasons women declined were various, and they do not add up to a simple portrait of any particular kind of woman. Some declined from instinct, a feeling, not quite articulable, that something about the offer was wrong in a way they could not entirely explain. Some declined from information. They had read something, heard something, knew a woman who had had a bad experience, and the information was sufficient to shift their decision even without the full clinical picture that later decades would provide. Some declined because the physicians in their lives, a family member who was a nurse, a husband who had medical training, a physician in their community whose practice was more cautious than the prevailing standard, told them not to. Some declined for reasons that had nothing to do with any of this, and everything to do with the specific texture of their own lives. The women who declined were not, in any meaningful sense, stronger or wiser or more prescient than the women who accepted. The word declined implies a clarity of decision that many of these women did not have. Many of them were simply not in the examining room when the offer was made, were seeing physicians who did not offer it, or were not seeing physicians at all, or were managing their relationship with their bodies through means other than medicine. The absence of the prescription in their lives was often not a refusal so much as an absence of encounter, Some women found their way to other approaches to the body that the culture was telling them to correct. They found communities, sometimes religious, sometimes social, sometimes the early communities of women who were beginning to question the assumptions of the domestic ideal, where the pressure was somewhat less total. They found relationships with their own bodies that were less defined by the culture's standard. They found, in some cases, therapists and doctors and writers who were doing the work of questioning the standard before the questioning had become mainstream. These women's experiences are as varied as the women themselves, and they do not constitute a simple alternative to the pharmaceutical path. They were, in many cases, harder paths in the immediate term, more resistant to the culture's insistence on the value of thinness, more demanding of a self-relationship that the culture was not designed to support. There is a particular category of woman who is worth holding for a moment: the woman who wanted the pill and could not have it, the woman who was uninsured, or whose physician did not prescribe it, or who lived in a community or a circumstance where the prescription was not available. The prescription years were not equitably distributed. The rainbow pill clinics were urban enterprises, concentrated in cities where middle-class women had access to private medical care. The amphetamine prescription required a physician willing to write it, and a pharmacy willing to fill it, and the economic resources to pay for it. Women outside the specific demographic of the white middle-class housewife were both more and less affected. More, because the cultural pressure around thinness applied to them through additional and different channels, including the specific racist histories of how black women's bodies were discussed and managed in American culture. Less, because access to the prescription itself was uneven in ways that track the more general inequities in healthcare access. The story of the prescription years is often told as though it happened to a single, relatively homogeneous group of women. This is a consequence of whose experiences are best documented and whose voices are most prominent in the historical record. The women who testified to congressional committees were predominantly white and middle class. The women who spoke to researchers in the 1970s were predominantly white and middle class. The women whose oral histories are most accessible are predominantly white and middle class. This does not mean that the experience was limited to that group. It means that the record is skewed toward that group, as records tend to be, and that recovering the broader story requires going further than the most accessible archives. Black women in the post-war era had their own relationship with weight and medicine that intersected with, but was not identical to the experience of white middle-class women. The racist caricature of the large black woman, used in advertising and popular culture in ways that were both degrading, and that, paradoxically, placed black women somewhat outside the specific aspirational framework of the hourglass ideal, created a different kind of cultural pressure. The message that black women's bodies were outside the standard of beauty was not the same as the message that they had fallen short of the standard. Both messages were harmful, both were cultural rather than clinical, both had pharmaceutical dimensions in various forms, but the specific amphetamine prescription years, which were so centrally about achieving a very specific cultural ideal, were shaped in part by who that ideal was designed for. Women in rural communities, women without access to private medical care, women in economic circumstances that made physician visits infrequent. These women were also making decisions about their bodies in relation to the decade's standards, and also experiencing the pressure that those standards created, and also had limited access to the information that would have helped them understand what they were being offered and what they were declining. The lack of access to the prescription did not automatically mean a lack of relationship to the culture's demand. The demand reached everywhere. The pill reached some places more than others. The women who did not take the pill are important to the story, not primarily as a contrast that makes the women who did take it look like they made a worse choice. The dichotomy of good choice and bad choice is not the lesson the history is offering. What the women who did not take it offer is evidence that the choice was not inevitable, that even within the cultural context that produced the demand and the medical context that provided the supply, women were making individual decisions about what to accept and what to decline. The decision space was constrained by the cultural pressure, by the medical authority, by the commercial interest, by the limited information available. But it was not closed. The 8 million chose to fill the prescription. Others chose differently. The number who chose differently was also large, and their reasons were also various, and their experiences were also real. Sitting with the full population, those who took the pills and those who did not, those who were offered them and those who were not, those who wanted them and could not access them, is a way of understanding the prescription years as something more complex than a pharmaceutical disaster that happened to a passive and undifferentiated group of women. It was a period in which millions of individual women, each one living in her own specific circumstances with her own specific history and her own specific relationship to the culture's standards, made decisions about their own bodies in a context that was not designed to give them full information or full freedom. Some of those decisions led to the orange bottle, some did not. All of them were made by real people doing the best they could with what they had. That is the human content of this history, and it is the most important thing to hold. The women who did not take the pill are, in a certain sense, invisible in the record of the prescription years. They are the negative space, defined by the absence of the thing that defined the others. But negative space is real space. It has its own shape, its own content, its own stories. And in the negative space of the prescription years, there are stories of women who found other relationships to the culture's demands, other ways of inhabiting a body in an era that had very strong opinions about what bodies should look like. Those relationships were not universally better, they were not uniformly successful, but they are part of the full picture. And the full picture, with all its complexity and variation and refusal of simple lesson, is what this history is made of. After Dexedrine, the next wave. Medicine does not stay still. This is one of its virtues, understood as the discipline's commitment to progress, to refinement, to the revision of practice in light of new evidence. It is also, in the specific context of the history of weight loss pharmacology, one of the mechanisms by which the same essential harm was able to repeat itself in successive decades, with only the molecule changed, while the fundamental dynamic, the pharmaceutical response to a culturally constructed demand producing short-term results and long-term consequences that the short-term evidence could not adequately capture, continued. By the late 1960s, as the regulatory environment around amphetamines was tightening, the pharmaceutical industry was already in the process of developing alternatives. The next significant class of weight loss medications would work differently at the level of mechanism from the amphetamines. They would act on different neurotransmitter systems, producing weight loss through a different pharmacological pathway, and they would therefore, the argument went, have a different safety profile from the drugs they were replacing. The argument was partially correct. The mechanism was genuinely different. The safety profile turned out to be different only in the sense that it produced different harms, not in the sense that it produced fewer of them. Fen-Phen arrived in the United States in 1973, approved by the FDA for the treatment of obesity. Where amphetamines acted primarily on the dopamine and norepinephrine systems, producing their appetite-suppressing and mood-elevating effects through stimulation, Fen-Phen acted primarily on the serotonin system, promoting the release of serotonin in ways that produced a sedating rather than a stimulating effect. The drug's effect on appetite was real. It reduced the appetite of a significant proportion of the people who took it, consistently enough for the clinical trials to support approval. The drug's other effects were also real, but they were less immediately visible. The short-term experience of Fen-Phen was different from the short-term experience of Dexedrine. Where Dexedrine elevated and sharpened, Fen-Phen quieted and softened. Women who had experienced the amphetamine high, with its energy and focus and general forward motion, found Fen-Phen to be something different, a dulling, in some accounts, that was not uncomfortable, but was not the enhancement that the previous drugs had provided. The appetite suppression was there, the mood effect was mild and generally calming rather than elevating. The drug produced a result, weight loss, by a route that felt less pharmaceutical than the amphetamine route had felt, which may have contributed to the sense that it was safer. The sense was not entirely wrong in the short term. Fen-Phen's dependency profile was substantially lower than amphetamines. The serotonergic mechanism produced a different kind of relationship between the user and the drug, less the craving and crash cycle of stimulant dependency, more a gradual dulling that was not pleasant but was not the dramatic dependency that amphetamines created. Women who stopped taking Fen-Phen did not typically experience the same profound dysphoria that women who stopped amphetamines had reported. The stopping was easier. This was counted as a safety feature, and in the specific dimension of dependency, it was. But safety is multidimensional, and the dimension where Fen-Phen would eventually reveal its cost was not dependency. It was the cardiovascular system. The drug's action on serotonin receptors had effects on the heart and on the pulmonary vasculature that were not apparent in short-term clinical trials and were not looked for systematically in the years of prescribing that followed approval. The mechanism by which serotonin affects the smooth muscle cells of blood vessels and the cells of the heart's valves was not yet understood well enough, in the early 1970s, to predict the cardiac effects that long-term use would produce. The understanding that developed later was that specific serotonin receptors in the cardiac valves respond to prolonged serotonergic stimulation in ways that cause abnormal thickening of the valve leaflets, a condition called cardiac valvulopathy that impairs the valve's ability to open and close properly. The valvulopathy was not found because it was not looked for. The clinical trials that established fenfluramine's approval were of short duration and did not include cardiac imaging as a standard assessment. The post-market surveillance system, though somewhat improved from the pre-1962 standard, was not sophisticated enough to detect a cardiac effect that developed gradually over years of use and that was asymptomatic in its early stages. The first systematic evidence linking fenfluramine to cardiac valvulopathy would not appear in the medical literature until 1997, 24 years after the drug's approval. In the interim, fenfluramine was prescribed, not at the volumes that amphetamines had achieved in the 1950s, but substantially, and then, in the 1990s, the combination was developed, fenfluramine paired with phentamine, a stimulant that worked on different receptors and in a different way, and that together with fenfluramine produced weight loss results that were substantially better than either drug achieved alone. The combination was called Fen-Phen. It was not approved as a combination, the FDA had approved each drug individually, not the pair, but combination prescribing of approved drugs is legal and common in American medical practice. Physicians prescribed Fen-Phen in large numbers. Estimates suggest that 6 million Americans were taking it in 1996 alone. The culture of the 1990s had its own relationship to thinness that was distinct from but related to the culture of the 1950s. The supermodel era had established a standard of extreme leanness that was different from the hourglass ideal of the 1950s but no less demanding in its specificity. Heroin chic, the aesthetic that valorized gauntness, pallor, the visible bones of the clavicle and the hip, had moved through mainstream fashion from underground origin to widespread cultural influence. The ideal body of the mid-1990s was thin in a way that even the 1950s had not specified. Thin without the fullness, thin without the softness, thin in a way that looked effortful because it was effortful and this was part of the aesthetic. Into this culture, Fen-Phen arrived with the particular promise that each previous generation of weight loss drugs had made: chemical assistance in achieving the body the culture required. The patients who received it were not all people with clinical obesity and obesity-related health conditions. They were a broader population that included people whose weight was within the normal range, but who wanted to be smaller, whose desire to be smaller was real, and their relationship to their own bodies genuinely distressed, and the culture that produced that distress entirely real. The prescribing ran ahead of the clinical indications. The prescribing ran ahead of the evidence. In August 1997, researchers at the Mayo Clinic published a report in the New England Journal of Medicine describing 24 patients who had developed unusual valvular heart disease while taking Fen-Phen. The patients had not been selected for having cardiac symptoms. They had been identified through routine follow-up echocardiography. The valve abnormalities were distinctive, thickening and regurgitation affecting the mitral and aortic valves in a pattern that had not been described in patients of these ages, and risk profiles in the pre-Fen-Phen literature. The finding was preliminary. 24 cases cannot definitively establish causation, but it was sufficient to prompt the FDA to issue a public health advisory and to open an investigation. Within weeks, additional reports from other centers confirmed the valvulopathy. The FDA moved quickly, by its own historical standards. The manufacturer withdrew fenfluramine and its chemical relative dexfenfluramine from the market in September 1997, less than 2 months after the Mayo Clinic report was published. This was substantially faster than the regulatory response to the amphetamine era had been. The speed reflected, among other things, the 1962 amendments changes to the FDA's authority and the post-market surveillance systems that had been built in the intervening decades. The systems were better. They were not perfect. They had allowed 24 years of prescribing before the cardiac effects were detected. The litigation was substantial. Wyeth, the manufacturer of fenfluramine, ultimately established a settlement fund that reached $21 billion, one of the largest pharmaceutical settlements in American legal history. The fund was intended to compensate the women and men who had taken the drug and suffered cardiac harm. Not all of them could be identified. Not all of them had received the cardiac screening that would have revealed the valvulopathy in cases where it was asymptomatic. Not all of them were compensated. The settlement was enormous. It was not adequate to the scale of what had happened. The pattern by now should be recognizable. It is the pattern of the previous era, with modifications. Different molecule, different mechanism, different specific harm, same structure, cultural demand, pharmaceutical response, short-term results, long-term consequences, delayed recognition, regulatory response, litigation. The pattern had run its course before. With amphetamines, it ran it again. With fenfluramine, it would run it again. The specifics changed because pharmacology advances. The structure repeated because the forces driving the structure, the cultural pressure, the commercial incentive, the regulatory limitation, the clinical enthusiasm, had not fundamentally changed. The women who had taken Fen-Phen and were now living with the knowledge of the valvulopathy, some of them with echocardiograms showing the specific pattern of damage, some of them with symptoms that had been attributed to other causes and were now being reassessed, were the most recent inheritors of the story that had begun with the women in the yellow linoleum kitchens of 1953. Different decade, different drug, the same fundamental position, inside a pharmaceutical intervention that had been presented as safe and had proved in the long term to be something more complicated than that. The doctors who knew. Within every era, within every medical consensus, there are the people who are asking the right question before the consensus is ready to hear it. Some of them are wrong, and their dissent is safely filed and eventually disproved, but some of them are careful and credentialed and methodical, and they are reading the same literature as their colleagues and arriving at different conclusions, and the conclusions they arrive at are eventually vindicated, arrived at the right destination but too early, before the institutional infrastructure for receiving them was in place. These are the people who live inside the gap, inside the 30 years between the first documented concerns and the regulatory response, inside the quiet knowledge that what is being prescribed should not, on the evidence, continue to be prescribed in the way it is being prescribed. John Griffith was a psychiatrist at Vanderbilt University who published research in 1972 demonstrating that chronic amphetamine use in doses comparable to those prescribed for weight loss could produce a syndrome closely resembling paranoid schizophrenia. The research involved administering amphetamines to volunteer subjects over periods that mimicked the duration of typical weight loss prescriptions and observing the psychiatric effects. The effects were pronounced and consistent. The syndrome was distinct from both the baseline state of the subjects and from other psychiatric presentations, and it resolved, slowly, imperfectly, when the drug was stopped. This was not a fringe finding. Griffith was a reputable researcher at an established institution, publishing in a peer-reviewed journal. The finding had clear implications for the millions of women who were, in 1972, still taking amphetamines prescribed by their physicians, a drug that could, in doses comparable to those in therapeutic use, produce a paranoid psychosis-like syndrome was not a drug that should be prescribed casually to 8 million otherwise healthy women. This was a conclusion that the evidence was making available. Whether the evidence reached the level of practice that mattered, the examining room, the prescription pad, is a different question. John Kramer, writing in the late 1960s and early 1970s about patterns of stimulant use in the general population, described a phenomenon that was not yet receiving adequate clinical attention: the large population of women who had obtained amphetamines through legitimate medical channels and were now dependent on them, whose dependency was invisible within the clinical categories of the time because they were not addicts, in any sense that the era recognized as addiction. They were patients. They were following their prescriptions. They were managing their weight. They were doing what they had been told to do. The dependency they had developed was a consequence of the doing, but the doing looked like compliance, and compliance was not the same category as addiction, and so the dependency remained nameless. Barbara Seaman's work represents a different kind of knowing, journalistic rather than clinical, directed at a general rather than a professional audience, but drawing on clinical research with a rigour that was unusual in health journalism of the era. Seaman's 1969 book, The Doctor's Case Against the Pill, examined the birth control pill's risks with a combination of clinical evidence and patient testimony that the pharmaceutical industry found threatening and that the FDA found uncomfortable enough to prompt congressional hearings on the quality and accessibility of information women received about pharmaceutical risks. Seaman did not write primarily about amphetamines, but she established the framework in which women's experiences of prescribed drugs were treated as clinical evidence rather than as emotional overreaction that subsequent work on diet pills would use. The women's health movement that grew through the late 1960s and 1970s was another form of knowing. Not clinical knowing, not published in peer-reviewed journals knowing, but knowing in the form of shared experience. Women talking to each other about what had happened to them with their prescriptions, comparing notes across the backyard fence and in the early consciousness-raising groups of the feminist movement, accumulating individual testimonies into a picture that was, in aggregate, more complete than any individual clinical study had yet produced. This form of knowing is not formally recognized by institutional medicine as evidence. It is not peer-reviewed. It does not appear in the index of medical journals. But it is evidence, and it was doing work, the work of naming, of creating the shared vocabulary that makes experience transmissible, in the decades when the formal systems were slower. The doctors who knew or suspected or worried and who acted on that knowing in their own practices, who did not prescribe these drugs, or who prescribed them with caution and with more attention to the dependency question than most of their colleagues, were acting against the current of a prescribing culture that was broad and confident. Clinical medicine in the 1950s and 1960s was not a culture that rewarded deviation from the standard of care. The standard of care was what a reasonable physician in the same circumstances would have done. In the circumstances of the late 1950s, a reasonable physician prescribed amphetamines to women who wanted to lose weight. That was what reasonable physicians did. Deviation from it was professionally legible as eccentricity, or excessive caution, or something that required justification. The justification was available for a physician who sought it. The dependency literature, the psychosis literature, the adverse event reports that were accumulating in the clinical literature. But seeking the justification required a disposition towards skepticism about the standard of care that was not uniformly distributed. It required the specific willingness to look beyond the evidence the pharmaceutical companies were providing and to consider the evidence that was arriving from less commercially motivated sources. In the 1950s and 1960s, with the research infrastructure less developed than it would become, with the regulatory framework less rigorous than it would become, with the patient advocacy networks less organized than they would become. In that era, the physician who independently arrived at skepticism about the prescription of amphetamines for weight loss was doing something that the system did not make easy. Some of them did it anyway. Medical biography, when it is written carefully, recovers their names and their arguments, and the reception those arguments received in their time. The reception was typically polite and ultimately inconsequential. A letter in the correspondence section of a journal, a comment at a professional meeting that was noted and then set aside, a refusal to prescribe that was interpreted by colleagues as overly cautious, and by patients who could go to a different physician for the prescription they wanted, as unhelpful. The individual dissent, before it has accumulated to a critical mass, tends not to change things. It is preserved in the record for the subsequent era to find and cite, but it does not change the practice in its own time. What changes practice is the accumulation of dissent to the point where the consensus can no longer hold it. The accumulation of adverse event reports to the point where they cannot be individually explained away. The congressional hearing that provides a public forum in which evidence that has been circulating in private must be presented in the open, where the pressure of the public record makes the usual responses of minimization and delay less available. The withdrawal of a drug that has become too clearly harmful to continue defending. These moments, the hearings, the withdrawals, the regulatory changes, are the visible events of the reckoning. They are preceded by years of quieter work, the research that accumulated, the testimony that was gathered, the naming that was done in living rooms and community centres and consciousness-raising groups, and in the clinical offices of the physicians who knew. The knowing is not heroic in most cases. The physicians who had concerns did not in the main mount dramatic stands against the pharmaceutical establishment. They wrote letters to journals, they adjusted their prescribing practices, They spoke cautiously at professional meetings. They wrote papers that documented what they were seeing in their own patients, and submitted those papers to journals that sometimes published them and sometimes did not. The heroism, if it belongs anywhere, belongs to the women who reported their experiences to these physicians and to researchers and to journalists and to each other, in the knowledge that the reporting would not always be well received and that the experience they were describing did not yet have a category that made it speakable. The physicians who knew a part of a longer story about how medicine comes to change its mind. They are the early evidence, the signal in the noise, the data points that will eventually constitute the pattern that forces the revision. They are not usually celebrated at the moment their knowing is most valuable, when it could still change what is happening. They are celebrated sometimes in the retrospective, when the pattern they identified has become so obvious that the identification seems, from the distance of decades, to have been the only reasonable conclusion. The distance required for that perception is exactly the distance that the women inside the era do not have. The physicians who prescribed without knowing or without acting on their knowing are also part of the story. They were not, in the main, cynics or villains. They were professionals operating within the framework they had been given, responding to the pressures the system placed on them, making decisions that the system at the time certified as correct. The framework was inadequate. The pressures were misaligned. The certification was premature. These are systemic failures, not moral ones, and the distinction matters for the way we understand the history and the way we draw its lessons. The lesson is not that physicians should have been more virtuous. The lesson is that the systems in which they were working should have been better designed to surface the evidence that would have changed their decisions. The design is what is available for revision. The virtue in any given individual is what it is. The doctors who knew, and the doctors who didn't, and the researchers who were trying to build the evidence that would close the gap between knowing and acting, all of them were working within a system that produced a particular outcome over a particular period for a particular population. The outcome was avoidable, in the sense that the evidence for avoiding it was available earlier than the avoidance was enacted. The avoidability is the lesson. The lesson has been partially learned. How partially is a question that the history of subsequent drug cycles, the history of Fen-Phen, of sibutramine, of the current wave, is still in the process of answering. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. What the women said. The historical record of the amphetamine prescription era is, like most historical records, skewed toward the institutional. The Senate hearings are documented. The regulatory decisions are documented. The pharmaceutical production figures are documented. What requires more deliberate and more patient excavation is what the women themselves experienced and understood and felt and failed to find words for at the time, and then eventually found words for later, when the later had provided both the distance and the vocabulary that the inside of the era lacked. Their accounts exist, scattered across oral history archives and recorded interviews in the letters sections of women's magazines, and the transcripts of congressional testimony and the patient records that researchers gathered in the 1970s. The gathering required going to them. They did not present themselves at the centre of the official history, because they were not at the centre of the official history. They were the subject of it, which is a different position. The accounts that survive share qualities that are worth naming carefully, because the qualities are themselves a kind of evidence about what the experience was and about who the women were who had it. They are specific. They attend to the physical experience of the drug with a precision that suggests careful attention to the body, rather than the construction of a narrative after the fact. They are thoughtful about causation. The women who describe their experiences are generally careful to distinguish between what they know the drug did and what they suspect but cannot confirm, between the effects that were clear and the effects that were ambiguous, and they are characterized by a complexity of feeling about the experience that resists the simple categories victim, survivor, innocent casualty that the official history sometimes tries to impose. Consider what one woman, speaking to a researcher in 1975, described about her first year on Dexedrine. She had been prescribed it in 1959, after the birth of her third child. The weight from the pregnancy had not come off the way the previous pregnancy's weight had come off, and her physician, a man she had known for years who had delivered 2 of her children, suggested the prescription. She started taking it in May. By July she had lost 12 pounds. By September, she was back to the weight she'd been at her wedding. She described this as the part that was worth remembering first, before anything else, because it was real and it mattered to her, and she did not want it to disappear into the narrative of what happened afterward. The weight loss was real. The relief was real. The sense of having returned to a version of herself that felt more fully herself was real. She wanted the record to hold all of that. And then she described the rest. The way the energy had gradually reorganized itself around the pill rather than existing independently of it. The way the afternoons without it, the afternoons when she forgot to take it, or when the prescription ran out before she could refill it, or when she deliberately tried to go without it to see what would happen, became a specific quality of heaviness that she recognized, eventually, as not being how she actually felt, but how she felt without the medication. The distinction sounds small in description, and is enormous in experience. The difference between the floor of your own capacity and the floor the drug sets. She talked about the particular experience of telling her physician. She'd gone in, somewhere in her third year on the prescription, and tried to describe the feeling that the pills had become something she needed, rather than something she was using, that the needing felt different from wanting, that she was frightened by the needing in a way she could not quite account for. Her physician had listened. He had nodded. He had said something about the medication's effects being variable across individuals and about the importance of maintaining the weight she had achieved, and he had refilled the prescription. She had left the office feeling simultaneously reassured and more frightened than before. Reassured because the physician's manner had been calm and authoritative, and more frightened because the calm authority had not actually addressed the thing she had tried to describe. The experience of trying to describe it and having the description not received, not rejected, not dismissed in any dramatic way, but simply not received in the way that would have changed what happened next, is one of the most consistent features of the accounts from this period. It appears in different forms in different testimonies, with different degrees of intensity and different clinical contexts. But the structure is recognizable. A woman identifies something about her experience of the medication that feels wrong, or frightening, or concerning. She attempts to communicate it to her physician, and the communication does not produce the response that the thing she has identified would, in a properly designed system, produce. It produces reassurance, or adjustment, or continuation. It does not produce stopping, or investigation, or acknowledgement that what she has described is a problem that the prescription has created. The gap between the woman's description and the physician's response is not always a gap of dishonesty. In many cases, probably in the majority of cases, the physician genuinely believed that what he was offering was the appropriate response. He may have believed that the anxiety the woman was describing was pre-existing, a feature of her personality or her circumstances rather than a consequence of the medication. He may have believed that the dependency she was describing was not dependency in any clinical sense, but simply the natural result of a medication working as it should. He may have believed, and been told by the pharmaceutical literature he had been given, that the risks of long-term amphetamine prescription for weight management were minimal in the doses typically prescribed. These beliefs were wrong. They were wrong because the evidence available to him had been filtered in the ways described elsewhere in this account. He was wrong because the system was wrong. The women were right because they were living in their bodies. What the women said, when they eventually said it to researchers and journalists and congressional committees and to each other, accumulated into something that the individual clinical encounter could not hold, a picture of a widespread experience, common enough to be structural, specific enough to implicate the drug rather than the individual, consistent enough across different women in different places at different times to constitute evidence that the official record had not captured. The accumulation took decades, but it happened, and when it had accumulated sufficiently, it changed things. There is a particular quality to the testimony of women who had taken these drugs for years and had then stopped and were speaking from the aftermath. The aftermath had provided distance, and the distance had provided perspective, and the perspective had allowed for a kind of clarity about the experience that was not available from inside it. They could now see the arc, the beginning, the middle, the dependency, the crash, the slow reconstruction, with something approaching comprehensiveness. The comprehensiveness allowed for nuance. These testimonies are not simple. They do not say, the drugs were bad and I was harmed. They say something more complicated, more careful, more honest about the mixed quality of the experience. Some women said they were angry, not primarily, not in the first breath, but eventually when the question of anger was put to them. They were angry that the information that would have allowed them to make a more fully informed decision had not been available to them. They were angry that the dependency had been allowed to develop over years before anyone in the medical system described it as dependency. They were angry that the weight came back, and that the culture still made them feel about the returning weight exactly what it had made them feel about it before the prescription, and that the prescription had not changed any of that, had only changed the weight for as long as they were taking it and produced dependency in the process. They were angry that the anger itself had no very clear place to go, no institution to receive it, no system to hold it accountable in ways that felt proportionate to what had happened. Some women said they were not angry. They had made peace with the experience, or something that looked enough like peace to sustain them. They acknowledged the dependency, acknowledged the cost, acknowledged the absence of adequate information, and still held alongside all of that the memory of the specific relief the pills had provided, the energy, the weight, the sense of management, as something that had been genuinely valuable in a period of their lives when they had needed it. This position is harder to hold in the official narrative than the anger is, because the official narrative prefers clarity, but it is a position that many of the women held, and it is the honest one, and dishonouring it in the name of narrative clarity would be its own kind of harm. The accounts of the physical consequences are among the most specific. The cardiac symptoms that some women developed and attributed, with varying degrees of certainty, to the years of amphetamine use. The permanent anxiety that some described, a baseline level of alertness that had been established by years of stimulant use, and had not fully resolved when the stimulant was gone. The sleep difficulties that persisted. The women who described, years or decades later, a relationship with their own bodies that had been permanently altered by the experience, a relationship of slightly more ambivalence, slightly more distrust than they imagined they would have had without the prescription years. And there are accounts of something harder to categorize, the sense, held by some women, that the prescription years had changed not just their bodies, but their relationship to their own authority over those bodies. That having been given a pharmaceutical solution to a cultural problem, and having taken it, and having experienced its consequences, they now understood something about the relationship between their own experience and the systems that interpreted that experience that they would not have understood otherwise. The understanding was not comfortable, but it was theirs. It belonged to them in a way that the prescription had not. What the women said, across all of these dimensions, was true. Verifiably, documentably true, in the specific ways that truth can be verified and documented. Consistent with the pharmacological literature, consistent with each other's accounts, consistent with the regulatory history that eventually confirmed what they had been describing. The truth had been available all along in their bodies, waiting for the institutions to develop sufficient capacity to receive it. The reception was imperfect and delayed and never complete, but it happened, and the happening mattered, and the accounts the women gave are still available, in the archives where they are preserved, for anyone who is willing to go looking for them. You could go looking for them someday, if this night and this story send you in that direction. They are quiet documents mostly. They do not announce themselves as important. They sit in boxes and in digital files alongside thousands of other documents about other things from the same period, but they carry something specific, the record of what it was actually like, from inside, and that record, with its specificity and its complexity, and its refusal of the simple story, is the kind of record that has the most to teach if it is given the patience it deserves. The daughters. The children in those yellow linoleum kitchens had mothers who were managing, who were thin or thinner than before, or working toward thinness with the help of a morning pill and a doctor's appointment every few weeks, and a scale in the bathroom that was checked with a particular focused attention every morning. The children did not necessarily know about the pills. The pills were a private part of the morning routine, taken with coffee in the way that private things are absorbed into routines, unremarkably without announcement, as though they had always been there. What the children absorbed was not the pill. The pill was too small to absorb. What they absorbed was the relationship between their mother and the mirror, the particular quality of attention their mother brought to her own body, the specific register in which food was discussed at the table, its caloric content, its threat, its potential for undoing the week's careful work. the value placed on smallness, the effort involved in its maintenance. Children are not taught these things in any direct sense. They are lived alongside, and the living alongside is its own education, more thorough than any explicit instruction, because it is built into the texture of ordinary days rather than announced as a lesson. The daughters of the women who took the rainbow pills grew up inside this education. They grew up in kitchens where certain foods were not purchased because they were bad, in a sense that was moral rather than purely nutritional. They grew up hearing their mothers make specific kinds of assessments about their own bodies and about the bodies of other women, assessments that carried a clear hierarchy of value in which smaller was better, and the gap between actual and ideal was a measure of something that mattered. They grew up watching the effort, the diet periods, the prescription periods, the periods of relative success, and the periods of disappointed backsliding, with the unconscious attention that children pay to the things that seem to matter most to the adults around them. The research on the intergenerational transmission of body image concerns is now substantial. Studies conducted from the 1990s onward have documented with some precision the mechanisms by which a mother's relationship to her own body influences her daughter's developing relationship to hers. The mechanisms include modelling, children observe and learn from the adults in their lives, and direct communication, including the comments that mothers make about their own bodies, and, more significantly for daughters' outcomes, the comments they make about their daughters' bodies. They include the emotional environment around food and eating that is created by parents' own eating behaviours. They include the extent to which appearance is used as a primary framework for evaluating the self and others. The daughters of the prescription years did not inherit the prescriptions directly. The regulatory changes of the 1970s made the specific drugs their mothers had taken harder to obtain, but they inherited the underlying relationship, the relationship in which the female body is a project under continuous management, in which the gap between the actual body and the standard body is a moral concern, in which food is something to be managed rather than simply eaten, in which the mirror in the morning has the authority to assess the day's starting conditions. This inheritance moved silently between generations, carried in the texture of daily life rather than in any explicit transmission. By the time these daughters were adults themselves, by the 1970s and 1980s, the eating disorder epidemic in young women was becoming visible to researchers and clinicians in ways it had not previously been. Anorexia nervosa had existed as a diagnosed condition since the 19th century, but its prevalence appeared to be increasing substantially in the post-war decades. Bulimia nervosa was formally described and named in 1979. The scale of subclinical disordered eating, the wide range of behaviours around food and the body that did not meet full diagnostic criteria, but represented significant departure from a healthy relationship with eating, was beginning to be measured and found to be very large. The connection between the cultural pressure that had produced the prescription years and the eating disorder epidemic that became visible in the 1970s and 1980s is not one-to-one. Eating disorders are complex conditions with multiple contributing factors, including genetic predispositions and neurobiological components that are not reducible to cultural influence. But the cultural influence is real and is well documented in the research. Cultures with more extreme thinness ideals show higher rates of eating disorders. The late 20th century was a period of intensifying thinness ideals, amplified first by television and then by increasingly image-saturated media. The daughters who were growing up inside this intensification were growing up inside a version of the same pressure that had sent their mothers to the diet pill clinics, a version that had been refined by decades of commercial investment and technological amplification into something more pervasive and more insistent than the hourglass ideal of the 1950s. Some daughters made it through this landscape in relatively good shape. Some found relationships with their bodies that were not defined by the culture's standard, through communities or experiences or inner resources that provided enough distance from the ambient noise to allow a different relationship to develop. Some found their way into feminist frameworks, into body-positive communities, into therapeutic relationships that helped them understand and resist the pressure. The landscape was not homogeneous, and the outcomes within it were not homogeneous. Many daughters did not make it through undamaged. They developed eating disorders that required treatment, or subclinical disordered eating that went untreated, or simply a persistent background anxiety about their bodies that was not clinically significant but was personally significant in the way that persistent background anxiety about anything significant is personally significant. They developed the specific relationship to the mirror that their mothers had taught them, not deliberately but inevitably, through the texture of daily life. They stood in front of it in the early morning and received the same instruction their mothers had received and their grandmothers had received. The instruction was older than any of them. It had survived the corset and the flapper and the hourglass and the Twiggy and the supermodel and the heroine chic, adapting its form to each new era while maintaining its essential content. Be smaller, be more controlled, be more manageable. The daughters are now, in many cases, mothers themselves. The grandchildren of the prescription years are adults. The daughters of the daughters are growing up in a cultural environment that is, in certain respects, more explicitly critical of the body standard than any previous era, that has the vocabulary of body positivity, that has the critique of diet culture, that has influencers and communities dedicated to a different framework for understanding the body. They are also growing up in a cultural environment that is more saturated with images than any previous era, that has the algorithmic amplification of thin bodies on platforms designed to maximize engagement, that has the GLP-1 moment and all the cultural implications of a new pharmaceutical wave promising what the previous waves promised. The intergenerational transmission is still happening. It will continue to happen. What changes across generations is the specific form the transmission takes, the specific drugs, the specific cultural standards, the specific vocabulary in which the pressure is expressed. What is more resistant to change is the underlying pattern, the instruction that a woman's body is a project to be managed, that the management requires continuous effort, and that the failure to manage is a failure of some significance. The pattern has been transmitted across 5 or 6 generations now, consistently enough to suggest that the transmission itself has become structural, embedded not just in any individual family's dynamics but in the culture's overall relationship with the female body. The daughters who are mothers now face a specific challenge: how to raise children in a culture that maintains this pressure without transmitting the pressure, or transmitting it as little as possible, or at least transmitting alongside it the tools for understanding it as pressure rather than as fact. The challenge is genuinely difficult. The culture is more powerful than any individual family, and the ambient noise of the body standard reaches children through screens and peers and the general atmosphere of a world that still measures women's value, partly in terms of their body's conformity to a standard. The best that any individual parent can do is imperfect, but it matters. What the daughters who are now raising daughters of their own know, that their grandmothers in the yellow linoleum kitchens did not know, is the shape of the pattern. They can see it more clearly than their grandmothers could, because they have more distance from the prescription years and more vocabulary for describing what the prescription years were. They know the story in a way that gives them, in principle, more capacity to refuse its repetition. The capacity is not the same as the refusal. The refusal requires more than knowing, but the knowing is where it starts.